Hello friends, how are you feeling tonight? I hope your body is relaxed and your mind is calm. If sleep feels far away, this story might help you drift gently into rest. Tonight, we're traveling back to the magnificent streets of Chang'an, the heart of the Tang Dynasty, where silk caravans stretch across deserts, lanterns glow over lotus-filled ponds, and whispered secrets in the imperial court shape the fate of an empire. We'll witness festivals of light, the delicate dance of power, and the quiet moments that reveal the heartbeat of a civilization. So, settle into your space, let your eyes grow heavy, and allow yourself to be carried along the rivers, gardens, and lantern-lit streets of ancient China. You'll watch the unfolding of stories filled with beauty, intrigue, and history, and by the end, your mind may find that gentle drift into rest you've been longing for. If you enjoy this journey into the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can join us on many more evenings of calm, historical storytelling. Night descends upon Chang'an like a silken curtain drawn across the stars. The wind carries the faint perfume of lotus and the sweetness of incense burning in hidden courtyards. Lanterns bloom along the avenues in colors of amber and rose, their reflections trembling upon canals lined with stone. Far off, the palace walls gleam under the moon, each tile catching a fragment of silver light. In a small chamber overlooking the Vermilion Bridge, a poet sits alone by his window. His robes are of pale silk, simple but clean, the hem faintly scented with sandalwood. A brush rests between his fingers, yet the page before him remains blank. He has written 100 poems in his youth, yet tonight, words refuse to rise. Beyond the city, the drums of the watchtower echo softly, marking another hour of the endless night. He remembers when Chang'an was younger, when laughter spilled through the tea houses, and the streets sang with merchants from faraway lands. The air was thick with voices, Persian traders selling glass, Turkish horsemen boasting of their steeds, monks from India whispering the teachings of the Buddha. The Tang Empire, vast and golden, gathered the world within its walls. And he, once a boy of ink-stained sleeves, had been chosen to serve among those who shaped its dreams. He closes his eyes, and memory returns like incense smoke curling through the air. He is 17 again, standing in the courtyard of the Imperial Academy. The plum blossoms are falling, each petal pale as snow. He holds his first completed poem, trembling as the master of verses reads it aloud. The old man's voice quivers with approval, and the young poet feels the pulse of destiny awaken in his chest. From that day, he belonged not to himself, but to words, to rhythm, to beauty, to the eternal promise of art. The poet learned quickly that in Chang'an, beauty was not an ornament but a power. A single poem, whispered in the right ear, could open doors of jade. A well-placed verse could earn a smile from a prince or the favor of the emperor himself. So he wrote tirelessly. He wrote of spring mornings, of cranes above the river, of the laughter of courtesans behind silken screens. And in time, his verses reached the palace of lasting harmony. The night breeze shifts. A bell tolls from the temple of great virtue, deep and slow. He rises, stepping onto the balcony. From here, the city looks endless, a tapestry of flickering lights, drifting smoke, and whispered prayers. Each house holds a story. Each shadow conceals a secret. Somewhere in one of those courtyards, someone hums an old melody. Somewhere, a lover waits beside a dim lamp. He takes a slow breath and exhales into the cool air. It carries the scent of river mist and plum blossoms. In the distance, the imperial palace looms like a sleeping dragon, its gates shut, its roofs shimmering faintly under the moon. The poet bows his head, murmuring the old lines his teacher once taught him. Empires rise and empires fall, yet moonlight remains unchanged. He knows those words will one day be his own truth, but not yet. Tonight, the city still glows. The drums still beat. The empire still dreams. And so, he returns to his desk, dips his brush in ink as black as midnight, and begins to write once more. The morning arrived slowly in Chang'an, like a soft silk unfurling across the sky. Pale light seeped through the latticed windows of the poet's small chamber, brushing the worn wooden floor and glinting upon the inkstone that had long accompanied him through years of study. Outside, the city stirred with gentle rhythm, the creak of wooden wheels along cobbled streets, the soft clatter of market stalls, the distant cry of a rooster marking a new day. But the poet remained still, savoring the calm before he would once again enter the world of the Golden Court. Today, like many days before, he would be summoned to the palace, where the emperor's favor and the fate of many rested not on the edge of a sword, but on the grace of a carefully crafted verse. As he folded his robe and tucked his brush behind his sleeve, he felt the familiar tremor of anticipation, a mixture of reverence, hope, and a quiet, underlying fear. The palace was a world apart from the streets, a place where marble and jade spoke louder than any voice, and where the slightest misstep could echo like a storm in the corridors of history. The streets leading to the palace were alive with merchants and travelers, their voices soft but persistent in the crisp morning air. Silk from the western deserts fluttered in the wind, and the smell of freshly baked rice cakes mingled with the scent of incense burning in small shrines. Beyond the bustling life of the common people, high walls and ornate gates awaited those who dared to pass into imperial splendor. Carved dragons wound along roof ridges, their eyes glinting in the sun as if guarding secrets too ancient for ordinary men to know. The poet paused at the bridge spanning the Jin River, watching its waters shimmer with the reflection of the rising sun. He had crossed this bridge countless times, yet each journey seemed anew, each morning a fresh opportunity to see the empire through a lens of wonder and poetry. Below, the river flowed with a gentle murmur, carrying petals from cherry trees planted along its banks, drifting slowly, silently, like messages from another world. He traced their movement with his eyes, imagining each one a line of verse yet to be written. By mid-morning, he arrived at the palace gates, where guards in armor of glimmering bronze and lacquered leather stood in disciplined silence. Their spears caught the light and threw it back in shards of gold and crimson. A servant, recognizing the poet, bowed low, gesturing for him to enter through the eastern corridor. Beyond the gates, courtiers and scribes moved with quiet efficiency, their robes brushing against the polished floors, a soft symphony of silk and motion. The air here smelled faintly of sandalwood and perfumed oils, and somewhere deep within the palace, a zither played a slow, melancholic tune. He was led to the Hall of Harmony, where the emperor often received his poets, scholars, and officials. The hall was immense, its ceilings painted with celestial motifs, dragons and phoenixes intertwined among clouds and stars. Lanterns swayed gently from carved beams, and sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colored patterns that shifted slowly across the polished floors. Here, every detail was deliberate, a testament to the empire's devotion to beauty and order. Even the tiles beneath his feet seemed to hum with silent stories of generations past. At the center of the hall, Emperor Xuanzong sat upon a platform of jade, his robes embroidered with gold threads depicting the rising sun and the great rivers of the empire. His eyes, sharp yet distant, watched the courtyard beyond the hall through tall, narrow windows, as though the city itself whispered to him in secret. When the poet approached, the emperor's gaze finally fell upon him, and a small, approving smile touched his lips. A single smile in this vast hall could elevate a poet to renown, or leave him forgotten in the shadows. The poet knelt lightly, bowing low, and spoke the lines he had prepared for this morning's recital. Words flowed softly, each syllable deliberate, each pause weighted with meaning. He recited of the early morning mists along the Yangtze, of cranes taking flight from jade ponds, of plum blossoms trembling in the gentle breeze. As his voice rose and fell, he felt the hall itself listening, the painted dragons silent, the lanterns swaying with quiet interest, the emperor leaning forward, rapt with attention. When the last line fell into silence, the emperor spoke, his voice low and calm. "Your words paint the empire not in gold and silk, but in the breath of its people. You remind us that beauty dwells as much in morning mists as in marble halls." The poet's heart swelled with gratitude, yet beneath it lingered the shadow of doubt, an awareness that favor in the Golden Court was as fleeting as the petals drifting along the Jin River. After the audience, he wandered the palace gardens, seeking solace among bamboo groves and koi ponds. Here, the world was softer, slower, a place where he could breathe without the weight of imperial expectation. The koi glided silently beneath lily pads, their scales catching glimmers of sunlight like scattered jewels. A breeze rustled the leaves, carrying whispers of distant laughter, and the faint strains of a lute played somewhere in the corridors beyond. The poet inhaled deeply, letting the serenity seep into his bones. He thought of the friends he had made in these gardens, painters and musicians, calligraphers and fellow poets. Together, they would share quiet meals beneath blooming magnolia trees, exchanging ideas, laughter, and the occasional secret complaint about the whims of the court. In these moments, the empire felt less like an edifice of power and more like a living, breathing tapestry, threaded with human lives, fleeting joys, and fragile hopes. As afternoon softened into evening, lanterns were lit once again, casting pools of gentle light across marble pathways. The poet returned to his chamber where paper and ink awaited. By the window, he began to write, capturing not the grandeur of the palace, but the subtle, ephemeral beauty of life. The shimmer of a koi in a garden pond, the distant toll of a bell marking dusk, the brush of a silk sleeve against the stone floor. Each line was a meditation, a quiet offering to the world, a fragment of memory suspended like mist above the river. And as night deepened, with the city of Chang'an draped in silver and gold, the poet leaned back, letting the brush rest. He closed his eyes, listening to the pulse of the empire, the soft footsteps of guards in distant corridors, the whispered laughter of servants, the lull of the river beyond the walls. In this moment, he felt both infinitesimal and infinite, a single note in the vast symphony of the Tang Dynasty, yet essential to its melody. Tonight, he thought, the empire is alive not in its grandeur, but in its quiet moments, the subtle motions of everyday life, the poetry of simple gestures, the fleeting beauty of existence itself. And tomorrow, he would rise again, crossing bridges, walking streets, entering halls of jade and gold, and continue to write, to capture, to preserve the silk and smoke of a world that thrived and shimmered beneath the rising and setting sun. The palace gardens stretched before him like a quiet world apart from the city, a sanctuary where time itself seemed to slow, and even the wind whispered with reverence. Curved bridges of polished stone arched delicately over jade-green ponds, where koi swam lazily beneath the shimmering surface, their scales catching the light in fleeting glimmers of ruby and gold. Bamboo groves swayed in measured rhythm, their slender trunks bending and straightening like dancers responding to some ancient, unseen music. The air was heavy with fragrance, magnolia, osmanthus, and the faint scent of freshly turned earth. And each inhale carried with it the calm of a world that could exist entirely apart from the palace's grandeur. The poet moved slowly along the winding paths, his silk robes brushing the moss-covered stones. He had learned long ago that the gardens were not merely decoration, but a mirror of the emperor's mind, ordered yet natural, deliberate yet alive with hidden life. Every pond, every pavilion, every carefully placed lantern or carved bench was a statement, a lesson, a subtle poem written in stone, water, and wood. Here, in this space between walls and sky, a poet could breathe, could reflect, could see the delicate threads that bound the empire together, threads made not of power or gold, but of beauty, observation, and patience. Emperor Xuanzong often strolled these gardens in the late afternoon, favoring quiet observation over conversation. Today, as the poet approached a small pavilion overlooking the largest pond, he saw the emperor there, seated cross-legged upon a carved stone bench, his gaze lost in the reflection of the water. Around him, lotus flowers floated lazily, their pale petals trembling when a soft breeze passed, as if acknowledging the presence of a mind attuned to subtle perfection. The poet knelt respectfully, then lowered himself to sit upon the stone floor. He did not speak immediately. Words were often unnecessary here, where silence held meaning equal to speech. For many moments they sat together, two figures framed by lantern light and the soft rustle of bamboo leaves, listening to the quiet symphony of the garden. The distant clatter of a gardener's rake, the murmur of water over smooth stones, the occasional cry of a night heron from the river beyond the palace walls. Finally, the emperor spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying no weight of command, only curiosity and quiet expectation. You have come many times to recite, yet you linger, watching the gardens. Tell me what you see, young poet. What does the Tang Empire look like through your eyes when it sleeps beneath this sun? The poet inhaled deeply, drawing in the mingled scents of lotus, bamboo, and the faint trace of incense from a nearby shrine. He let his mind drift over the countless hours spent wandering these paths, over the laughter of court musicians, tuning their zithers, the distant shuffle of servants carrying trays of tea, the soft murmurs of children playing in hidden courtyards. And then in his mind, he painted what could not be painted with brush or ink. The quiet resilience of the people who lived beyond the palace walls, the courage of the soldiers stationed along distant frontiers, the delicate joys and sorrows of lovers hidden behind carved screens. The empire, he said at last, is not only marble and silk, not only the weight of gold or the roar of armies. It is this, the subtle currents of life, the sigh of bamboo in the wind, the shimmer of koi beneath the pond, the laughter and tears that pass unnoticed beyond these walls. These things endure longer than palaces, more faithfully than stone dragons. The emperor nodded slowly, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. You see what many do not see. That is why your words are treasured. But remember, beauty is fragile, even here. A storm, a rebellion, a careless word, and the harmony can vanish like smoke across water. The poet's thoughts wandered then to the recent rumors along the northern frontiers, the murmurs of unrest, whispers of generals plotting rebellion, the distant drums of war carried faintly by the wind. In the garden, surrounded by stillness, it seemed impossible. Yet he knew the world beyond these walls was always restless, always moving toward uncertainty. He pictured the armies stationed along the Great Wall, their eyes alert, their hands steady on their spears. He pictured the villages beyond the mountains, where farmers bent to the soil at dawn, unaware of the shifts in imperial power that might one day wash over them like a tide. Yet here, in the emperor's garden, all of that was momentarily suspended. The lotus flowers floated untouched by worry. The koi glided through the water, serene and untroubled. The bamboo leaves continued their quiet dance. Even the distant hum of the city, muffled by the palace walls, seemed gentle, as if the world itself had taken a deep, deliberate breath. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows over the stone paths, the poet rose and retrieved his brush and paper. He wrote there, beside the emperor, capturing not the grandeur of the palace, but the quiet heartbeat of life itself. The whisper of wind through leaves, the shimmer of water disturbed by a single fish, the slow unfolding of petals on a lotus bloom. Each line was a meditation, a prayer, a fragment of truth set upon paper. He wrote of the emperor, not as a ruler, but as a man who walked among gardens, who sought harmony, who listened. He wrote of the gardens themselves, as living testimony to patience, balance, and beauty. And he wrote of himself, a witness to a fleeting perfection, aware that moments like this could not last, that the silk and smoke of life was fragile, ephemeral, yet infinitely precious. When dusk fell, lanterns flickered along the winding paths, casting pools of soft light over carved stones and gentle ripples of water. The poet paused, laid down his brush, and let the quiet of the evening settle into his bones. He looked across the pond at the emperor, whose eyes had closed in contemplation, and felt the pulse of the empire in this serene place, not in armies or gold, but in the subtle interplay of light, sound, and breath. Tonight, he thought, the Tang dynasty lives not in proclamations or victories, but in gardens, in poetry, in the careful attention given to each leaf, each petal, each shadow. Tomorrow, he would rise again, walk these paths, recite his verses, and bear witness once more to the beauty that endures quietly beneath the ever-turning world. And as he left the pavilion, the koi stirred beneath the water, the bamboo whispered in the evening breeze, and the lotus flowers folded gently for the night, carrying the poet's thoughts with them into the vast, silver-lit expanse of Chang'an. Beyond the eastern wing of the palace, where the sun's rays struck the tiles with gentle warmth, a small pavilion stood cloaked in wisteria and jade-colored silk curtains. It was a quiet place, rarely disturbed by the footfalls of courtiers or the clang of palace duties. A hidden jewel within the sprawling gardens, where time slowed and even the wind seemed to speak with soft discretion. The poet had discovered it months before, guided by a friend who had smiled enigmatically and whispered only, "Some things are meant to be observed, not told." He approached carefully, mindful that even the slightest noise might break the delicate spell of the pavilion. As he stepped across the carved stone path, he felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. This was a world within a world, a space where beauty and serenity gathered like dew on morning petals. And today, he had been summoned not merely to wander, but to encounter the lady who resided within. A woman whose presence had become, in its quiet mystery, a thread woven deeply into his imagination. She sat at the far end of the pavilion, arranging a small bouquet of chrysanthemums in a carved porcelain vase. Her robes were pale green, embroidered with cranes in flight, and the fabric flowed like water over the stones beneath her feet. She moved with the grace of a crane herself, each gesture deliberate, each motion imbued with silent poetry. When she looked up, the poet felt the world narrow into the space between their eyes. Her gaze was calm yet penetrating, as if she could read the currents of his thoughts without a word being spoken. "Good morning," he said softly, bowing his head in deference. "Good morning," she replied, her voice as gentle as wind through bamboo. There was no formality, no overt courtly display, just a quiet acknowledgement that in this space they could speak and exist freely. For a long moment, they simply watched the garden together. Koi rippled beneath the pond's surface, petals drifted lazily in the breeze, and somewhere distant, a zither played a delicate melody. The poet felt the tension of court life, the unending expectations and obligations dissolve into the air like smoke from the incense burning nearby. Here, time had no crown, no emperor, no decree, only the slow, deliberate passage of light and shadow. "Your verses reach even the emperor's ears," she said at last, placing a chrysanthemum carefully into the vase. "He praises your skill, yet I wonder what you see when you write, alone, without the weight of expectation pressing upon you." The poet smiled faintly. "I see the things that the court overlooks," he replied. "The quiet life behind the palace walls, the murmur of bamboo, the shimmer of koi, the way petals drift upon water without care for gold or rank. In those things, I find truth, and sometimes the courage to write of it." She inclined her head, a small smile curving her lips. "Truth is precious," she said softly. "Even in the Tang dynasty, even within these walls, beauty and honesty are treasures more rare than jade or gold." They spoke little after that, letting the language of gestures and glances carry meaning. The poet noticed the delicate curve of her hands as she arranged flowers, the way her eyes lingered on the pond, the way the sunlight caught the threads of her robes and made them shimmer with subtle light. He tried to commit every detail to memory, knowing that these quiet moments, unrecorded by scroll or song, were the true treasures of life. In the weeks that followed, he returned often to the Jade Pavilion, sometimes with ink and brush, sometimes simply to sit in silence beside her. They exchanged thoughts on poetry, on music, on the natural world, finding in each other a rare resonance. She spoke of distant rivers and mountains she had never seen, of the taste of spring rain on plum blossoms, of the scent of tea leaves brewed carefully in the morning. He wrote as she spoke, translating her words and their shared experiences into verses that captured the subtle motion of life, the shimmer of water, the bend of bamboo, the fleeting light of dawn. Yet even amid this calm, the poet could not escape the shadows of reality. The empire beyond the gardens remained as it always had, vast, complex, alive with ambition, rivalry, and unspoken dangers. Courtiers whispered of appointments and dismissals, of generals gaining favor and others falling from grace. Rumors of rebellion stirred in the northern provinces, carried faintly by wind and river, like distant drums whose cadence was known, but whose message remained obscured. One evening, as twilight bathed the pavilion in a soft lavender hue, the lady spoke in a voice tinged with quiet concern. "The world beyond these walls shifts," she said. "Even here, within the emperor's gardens, we are not entirely free. You may write, you may observe, but do not forget that the empire breathes in ways that can both nurture and destroy." The poet nodded, understanding the weight behind her gentle words. He had learned over months of service and observation that beauty alone could not shield one from fate. Yet in this pavilion, in her presence, he felt a rare equilibrium, a momentary suspension of time where the silk and smoke of life intertwined perfectly with poetry, friendship, and a fragile kind of trust. Night fell slowly, the lanterns flickering like distant stars suspended among the wisteria vines. The koi in the pond became shadows beneath the dim light, and the petals of the chrysanthemums folded quietly in their vase. The poet rose, bowing respectfully before the lady, and left the pavilion with a heart heavy with both joy and awareness. He knew that each return to this quiet space would be a delicate negotiation between desire and discretion, between the longing to be near her and the understanding that the world beyond the garden walls could never be ignored. Yet he walked with a calm assurance, for even in fleeting moments, even within the fragility of time and favor, he had glimpsed a beauty worth capturing, worth preserving in ink and verse. The night air carried the scent of lotus from distant ponds, mingled with the subtle smoke of incense from palace shrines. The poet inhaled deeply, letting the fragrances settle in his mind, each one a brushstroke upon the canvas of memory. He would return tomorrow, and the next day, and the days after, until the empire's light or shadow reached him, whichever came first. For now, he walked beneath the soft glow of lanterns, listening to the quiet rhythm of Chang'an at rest, carrying with him the memory of jade silk, chrysanthemums, and the fragile, luminous presence of the Lady of Jade Pavilion. And somewhere, deep within the palace walls, he felt that the empire, for all its power and grandeur, had yielded a single perfect moment, one that belonged to poetry, to quiet reflection, and to the slow, unending passage of beauty itself. Even as dawn unfurled across the city, the palace seemed reluctant to awaken. Light filtered slowly through carved wooden screens, painting latticed patterns upon the polished floors. In the quiet chambers, silk curtains fluttered softly in the breeze, carrying the faint scent of incense and the lingering perfume of magnolia. The poet moved through these spaces with a sense of reverence, aware that each step echoed lightly, a subtle ripple through the otherwise still air. The world outside the palace walls hummed faintly with life. Merchants called softly from the streets, their voices carrying the promise of spices, silk, and tea. Children, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, chased one another along narrow alleys, laughing in small bursts that seemed almost forbidden in the hush of early morning. Yet within the palace, every sound was softened, contained, measured, as if even the air had learned discretion. The poet carried a small bundle of ink and brushes to the Jade Pavilion. Though the morning was young, the Lady of Jade Pavilion had already begun arranging her flowers, a subtle ritual she performed daily. Her hands moved with precision, yet there was a fluid grace to each motion, as though each petal and stem was a line of poetry in itself. When she noticed the poet's approach, her lips curved in a faint, almost secret smile, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. "Good morning," he said softly, bowing slightly. "Good morning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, blending with the rustle of bamboo leaves. "The morning air feels thick with stories today." He nodded, sensing the underlying truth in her words. The palace, for all its beauty, was alive not only with whispers of poetry, but with subtler currents. Rumors carried by servants, glances exchanged by courtiers, shadows of ambition stretching through the corridors. In the quiet of the Jade Pavilion, one could hear these whispers if one listened closely, like the soft murmur of smoke curling from a distant brazier. They walked together along the pavilion's veranda, their feet brushing lightly over the smooth stones. Koi swam beneath them in slow circles, disturbing the reflection of wisteria vines and bamboo in the pond. The poet thought of the empire as a living tapestry, threads of silk and smoke intertwining, delicate and fragile, carrying secrets, desires, and the imperceptible movements of fate. "The palace holds many masks," she said after a long pause. "Even the emperor himself wears them. Do you not feel it?" He did. The poet had long sensed the layers of intention, the carefully measured motions of those who served in the Golden Court. To survive here required more than talent. It demanded intuition, patience, and an awareness of the invisible threads that bound favor, power, and danger together. Yet in this quiet corner, far from the gaze of courtiers and guards, he felt the freedom to observe truth, to notice subtleties others ignored. He began to write then, brush gliding over paper, capturing not the grandeur of courtly events, but the delicate, almost imperceptible poetry of life around him. The swirl of smoke from incense rising in delicate spirals, the shimmer of sunlight on jade tiles, the whisper of silk as servants passed unseen. Each line became a meditation, a quiet homage to a world often unnoticed in the clamor of ambition and protocol. Hours passed as they shared this stillness. Words were exchanged sparingly, yet every glance and gesture carried meaning. She spoke of music she had heard in distant corridors, of a lute player whose melody lingered like a shadow, of the way light fell across a marble statue and made it seem almost alive. He wrote of these things, translating moments into verse, aware that the act of writing itself was a kind of preservation, a way to freeze beauty against the inevitable tides of time. In the late afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of the river beyond the palace walls. He paused to observe a single petal drifting upon the pond's surface, moving with gentle deliberation. The image struck him profoundly. The empire itself, vast and powerful, yet subject to currents beyond its control, like a lone blossom floating across an endless expanse of water. She watched him closely, sensing the weight of his thoughts. "You always see the world differently," she said softly. "Most walk without noticing. But you capture what others ignore. It is both a gift and a burden." He nodded, silently acknowledging the truth of her observation. To see clearly in this palace was to know both beauty and fragility, to recognize that the finest threads of silk could unravel with the slightest tension. And yet, he would continue to write, to observe, to bear witness. The empire, for all its impermanence, could be held in memory and verse, even if only for a fleeting moment. As twilight approached, the pavilion filled with a soft amber glow. Lanterns were lit, their flickering flames reflecting in the pond, creating a dance of light and shadow. The koi beneath the water shimmered with each ripple, the wisteria petals hung heavy with evening dew, and the bamboos swayed in gentle rhythm, as if acknowledging the quiet harmony of the moment. They remained there, side by side, in contemplative silence, listening to the whispers of the garden, of silk and smoke mingling with shadow and light. And as the city beyond the walls of the palace slowly transitioned into the muted tones of night, the poet felt the delicate balance of his world, an awareness that life, though fragile, held moments of profound beauty, moments that demanded nothing but attention and reverence. When he finally rose to leave, the lady's eyes followed him with a quiet intensity, a subtle reminder that even in a vast empire, the smallest gestures could carry weight, the gentlest whispers could echo through time. He walked back along the stone path, the scent of lotus and incense lingering in his mind, knowing that he had glimpsed something both eternal and ephemeral, the silk and smoke of life itself hovering gently between shadow and light, between memory and reality, between desire and restraint. And as night fully descended upon Chang'an, the city seemed to hold its breath. Lanterns flickered like distant stars, and the subtle murmur of the palace whispered its secrets only to those who would listen. The poet returned to his chamber, ink and brush in hand, ready to capture another day, another whisper, another fragment of the impermanent, luminous world that surrounded him. The morning mist still clung to the stone paths of the palace gardens when the poet stepped outside. The faint scent of dew and lotus carried on the gentle wind. Today, he was not heading to the Jade Pavilion, but to a quieter corner of the grounds, where a painter had taken residence in a small studio overlooking a lily pond. The painter's reputation was whispered among courtiers and artists alike. His brush captured not merely the outward forms of the world, but the fleeting essence of life, the breath of rivers, the pulse of wind through bamboo, the shimmer of sunlight on silk robes. As the poet approached, he could hear the soft scratch of brush against paper, mingling with the subtle ripple of water in the pond. The studio was modest, constructed of carved teak with wide windows that framed the garden like living paintings. Scrolls hung upon the walls, depicting mountains, rivers, and fleeting moments of human life, rendered with delicate precision. The painter moved with careful deliberation, his hand steady yet fluid, each stroke carrying the weight of thought and the grace of instinct. "Good morning," the poet said quietly, bowing as he entered. "Good morning," the painter replied, not pausing his work. "Your arrival is expected, yet unhurried, like the river itself." The poet smiled faintly, appreciating the subtle compliment. Here, words were measured, not wasted. Each carried intention, nuance, and rhythm. He stepped closer to the pond, observing the water lilies, the koi beneath the surface, the light drifting in through latticed windows. "Your brush captures life as it breathes," he said softly. "Each line seems more than mere pigment. It seems like memory made visible." The painter nodded, setting the brush down briefly. "And your words capture the same, though in a different medium. Together, perhaps, we may glimpse the fullness of a moment." They spoke little after that, allowing the quiet of the studio to weave its magic. The poet began to recite softly, lines of verse inspired by the garden, the pond, the distant laughter of palace children playing behind carved screens. The painter listened, eyes tracing the poet's gestures, translating sounds into imagined forms, translating imagined forms into brushstrokes upon the scroll. Time passed unnoticed. Outside, the palace stirred, yet within the studio, the world felt suspended. Each ripple on the pond, each petal drifting from a nearby wisteria vine, became a symbol, a note in a symphony of observation. The poet and the painter existed not merely in their physical forms, but in the currents of beauty that flowed between brush, ink, word, and silence. At one point, the painter picked up a blank scroll and gestured toward the poet. "Your words today are vivid," he said. "Let me attempt to make them tangible." The poet watched as the brush moved, tracing lines that became mountains, streams, figures bending to tasks, birds in flight. He recognized not merely the forms, but the essence, the motion, the breath, the invisible pulse that connected all things. Each stroke seemed to echo a line of verse, each shade a subtle rhythm, a reflection of light and shadow captured in time. "You see the world beyond the obvious," the painter remarked, glancing at the poet. "Few have eyes attuned to such quiet beauty. The empire itself, in its splendor, often blinds those who dwell within it. Yet you see both the marble and the moss, the lanterns and the shadows, the fleeting and the enduring." The poet lowered his head, acknowledging the truth in the observation. He had learned to navigate the Golden Court with caution and care, to listen to whispers carried by servants and courtiers, to sense the undercurrents of power and favor. And yet here, in this studio, he was free from expectation. He was not merely a court poet. He was a witness, a recorder of impermanence, a chronicler of silk and smoke. Outside, the afternoon deepened, light filtering through leaves and latticework, casting delicate patterns across the studio floor. Koi glided beneath the pond, petals floated, and the distant toll of a bell from a nearby temple marked the passage of time. The poet felt the weight of history and the fragility of the present mingling in the space around him. The Tang Dynasty, with all its power and glory, existed not merely in palaces or decrees, but in these quiet moments, captured in ink and brush, in whispered verse, in the play of sunlight on stone and water. When the painter finally laid down his brush, the scroll before him shimmered with life. Mountains and rivers seemed to breathe, figures moved with silent grace, and the pond appeared to ripple with the motion of wind and memory. The poet, reading the work, felt a resonance deep within him. Here was the empire not as power or conquest, but as living poetry, as fleeting, delicate, enduring beauty. They spoke little more, letting the shared understanding remain unbroken. When the poet rose to leave, he carried not only the memory of the brushwork, but the affirmation of his own vision, that words, like brushstrokes, could preserve fleeting moments, giving permanence to the ephemeral. As he walked back toward his chamber, lanterns were being lit along palace paths, their flames catching on silk banners and jade tiles, flickering gently like captured stars. The air was filled with the faint scent of incense and evening flowers, mingled with the distant sounds of the city settling into night. The poet inhaled deeply, feeling the rhythm of the empire in every breath, the pulse of Chang'an in every sound and shadow. And he understood, as he often did in quiet reflection, that his role was not to command or to conquer, but to observe, to preserve, to translate the subtle beauty of a vast, intricate world into words that might outlast even marble halls and golden roofs. He carried with him the silk and smoke of life, the delicate, ephemeral threads of existence that, if captured just so, could endure in memory and verse, long after shadows had fallen across the empire. Tonight, he thought, the Tang Dynasty lives not only in imperial edicts or courtly grandeur, but in these small luminous spaces, where brush meets paper, where words meet silence, where light, shadow, and heart converge in fleeting harmony. And tomorrow, he would rise again, crossing stone paths and bridges, entering halls and gardens, recording yet another fragment of the empire's infinite, impermanent beauty. The evening arrived in Chang'an with a gentle hush, the city streets bathed in the soft glow of lanterns swaying in the evening breeze. Their light spilled over cobbled paths and jade tiles, casting a golden warmth upon the pale faces of courtiers returning from their duties. The air was rich with the mingling scents of night-blooming osmanthus, incense from distant temples, and the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts from market stalls. Even the river, which wound through the city like a ribbon of ink, reflected the glow of lanterns in ripples that danced slowly across its surface. The poet walked through the palace gates, careful to tread lightly as he made his way toward the main courtyard where the Night of Lanterns festival was underway. Tonight, the emperor had decreed that the palace be filled with soft lights, music, and poetry, a night to honor both the beauty of the empire and the fleeting impermanence of life. Lanterns of every shape and size hung from trees, roof eaves, and delicate wooden frames, their paper shades painted with dragons, phoenixes, plum blossoms, and distant mountains. Each lantern swayed slightly in the breeze, as if breathing in rhythm with the pulse of the city. He paused briefly at the edge of the courtyard, observing the scene. Courtiers in flowing robes moved gracefully among the lanterns, their laughter soft and controlled, like the gentle trickle of a stream. Musicians played zithers and flutes, their notes weaving through the air with a deliberate, almost meditative rhythm. Servants carried trays of tea and delicate pastries, offering them with a bow, their presence barely audible over the faint rustle of silk and whispered conversation. The entire scene felt suspended in time, a fragile tableau of harmony and elegance that could vanish with the shift of a single shadow. The poet's gaze was drawn to the Lady of Jade Pavilion, who stood near a cluster of lanterns shaped like cranes in flight. Her robe shimmered softly in the light, embroidered with gold threads that caught the glow of lantern flames. She held a small paper lantern in her hands, delicate and pale, painted with tiny plum blossoms. When she noticed the poet approaching, her smile was subtle but luminous, a beacon in the soft night. "You have come," she whispered, her voice blending with the faint hum of the courtyard. "The night is alive with its own poetry tonight. Do you feel it?" He nodded, holding his own lantern, painted with rippling water and floating petals. "It is as if the empire itself has exhaled," he said softly. "Each light, each sound, each movement, it all feels part of a single, fragile breath." Together, they walked among the lanterns, their steps careful, their eyes drinking in the interplay of light and shadow. The poet observed the reactions of the courtiers. Some paused to admire a lantern, its delicate brushwork. Others whispered brief verses inspired by the scene, while children with paper cranes in hand darted playfully through the paths, their laughter ringing faintly like silver bells. It was a night of beauty and quiet reflection, a night where the empire's grandeur softened into intimacy. The emperor appeared shortly thereafter, walking slowly with a measured grace among the lanterns, accompanied by a few close courtiers. His robe of deep crimson glimmered faintly under the lantern light, embroidered with golden dragons coiled around clouds. He paused near a small pond, where lanterns floated upon the water's surface like stars cast upon the river of the world. The poet noticed the emperor's expression, calm, contemplative, as though he too understood the fragile impermanence of these glowing symbols. The Lady of Jade Pavilion handed the poet a small brush and a sheet of paper, whispering, "Capture the night. Not its grandeur, but its quiet moments, its fleeting echoes. Let it live in ink, if only briefly." He knelt beside a low stone bench, and under the glow of lantern light began to write. Words flowed softly, tracing the ripple of water beneath floating lights, the gentle sway of silk robes, the tender laughter of children darting between shadows. Each line became a small universe, a microcosm of the empire distilled into verse. He wrote of koi beneath the lantern-lit pond, of petals falling from plum trees into the water, of the subtle glimmer of gold threads in the emperor's robe, reflecting moonlight like distant stars. Time slipped unnoticed. Shadows lengthened, lanterns swayed, and the faint strains of zither music drifted through the courtyard. The poet's verses captured not only the scene before him, but also the fleeting sensation of it. The quiet sigh of a breeze, the warmth of a friend's glance, the imperceptible rhythm of life that passed around and through him. In this delicate interplay of light and shadow, sound and silence, he felt the empire itself speaking in whispers of silk and smoke. The Lady of Jade Pavilion remained nearby, her presence both grounding and inspiring, a quiet witness to the poet's work. She moved with measured grace among the lanterns, adjusting one here, touching another there, her hands leaving traces of attention and care, as delicate as the brushstrokes on paper. The poet noted each movement, translating it silently into verse, aware that even the smallest gesture could carry meaning far beyond its surface. As night deepened, the lanterns flickered more softly, casting long fluid shadows across the courtyard. The emperor, having completed his quiet circuit, returned to the palace hall, leaving the gardens to the poet, the lady, and the lingering echoes of the festival. They walked together along a narrow path beside the pond, the reflection of lanterns shimmering like fireflies across the water. The poet spoke finally, his voice low and deliberate. "Tonight, I have seen the empire not as power or decree, but as light and shadow, as fleeting beauty that lingers only for those who notice. It is fragile, ephemeral, yet unforgettable. She smiled faintly, the glow of lantern light painting her face with soft hues. "That is why your words endure," she said. "You preserve what others might overlook. You capture the silk and smoke of life itself." The poet held his brush carefully, feeling the weight of both paper and moment. The night of lanterns would pass, as all nights did. Yet its essence, the interplay of light, life, and quiet reflection, would live on in his verses. And as he walked back through the palace gates, the soft glow of lanterns trailing behind him like a constellation, he felt the delicate pulse of the Tang Dynasty itself. Vast, intricate, and infinitely alive in moments such as these, where beauty was noticed, preserved, and quietly celebrated. The city slept gently beneath the soft moonlight, the river reflecting lanterns that had now drifted silently downstream. And somewhere deep within the palace walls, the poet felt the rhythm of life continue, the whispers of silk and smoke, the subtle heartbeat of a civilization that thrived as much in quiet moments as in the roar of power. The city of Chang'an awoke slowly, bathed in the soft light of dawn, yet the palace itself seemed already alive with anticipation. Today marked the Imperial Festival of Music, a celebration of sound and harmony, a night in which the emperor invited musicians, poets, and dancers from across the empire to perform beneath gilded roofs and beneath lanterns hung like captured sunlight. The air was thick with anticipation, mingled with the faint scent of incense, freshly polished wood, and the crisp morning breeze drifting through open corridors. The poet moved through the marble halls, ink and paper secured beneath his arm, his thoughts alive with quiet excitement. He had attended the festival many times before, yet each year the spectacle felt fresh, vibrant, and infinitely intricate. Musicians tuning their zithers and flutes whispered softly to one another, their voices merging with the hum of palace servants and the distant clatter of bronze gongs that marked the hour. The Lady of Jade Pavilion was already in her place near the eastern veranda, her robes a delicate green that shimmered like new leaves in sunlight. She held a small fan, carved from sandalwood, her fingers tracing the lattice work as she waited. The emperor appeared at the main hall, robes of deep crimson embroidered with gold dragons flowing like a river of fire. His presence was commanding yet serene, a careful balance of authority and quiet dignity. He bowed briefly to assembled musicians, his gaze sweeping across the courtyard, acknowledging the poets and courtiers without disturbing the delicate harmony of preparation. The poet knelt respectfully, noting the subtle tension that always accompanied the arrival of the emperor, a tension tempered by centuries of ritual, expectation, and deliberate grace. When the first notes rang out, the festival truly began. Flutes pierced the morning air with soft melodic clarity, followed by the gentle pluck of zithers, the percussive beat of drums that echoed faintly like distant footsteps on stone. Dancers in flowing robes moved in slow, deliberate patterns, their feet brushing the polished floors in time with the music, their arms extending as if tracing invisible arcs of poetry in the air. Lanterns reflected the rising sun in delicate patterns, and the entire courtyard seemed to shimmer with life. The poet opened his scroll and began to write, capturing the interplay of light, sound, and motion with careful precision. Each line of verse sought to preserve the rhythm of the music, the subtle gestures of the dancers, the way sunlight caught a thread of silk in mid-motion. The festival was more than entertainment. It was an expression of the empire's soul, a reflection of its balance, its beauty, and its fleeting impermanence. Between performances, the poet observed the musicians quietly, noting the flicker of emotion across their faces, the subtle exchange of glances that signaled a change in tempo, the careful discipline that allowed artistry to bloom without flaw. He noted the dancers, their eyes bright with focus, their movements both deliberate and spontaneous, capturing the essence of a story that could not be spoken, only expressed through motion. And he noted the emperor, who moved through the courtyard with measured grace, his expression calm, absorbing the festival as both ruler and witness. The Lady of Jade Pavilion leaned toward him at one point, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel it?" she asked. "The music carries the empire itself, its hopes, its joys, its sorrows, all bound together in rhythm and melody. Can you capture it?" He nodded, lifting his brush carefully. "I will try," he murmured, allowing the ink to flow across the page like the soft currents of a river. He wrote of the way the sunlight caught the zither strings, creating tiny arcs of gold, of the dancers' robes flowing like water, each gesture a delicate wave, of the subtle breath of wind that carried music across the courtyard, binding performers and audience together in shared awareness. Each stroke became a small universe, a meditation upon beauty, motion, and the fleeting harmony of life. Hours passed unnoticed, the sun climbing high, casting soft shadows across stone and water. Courtiers offered tea and delicate pastries, their presence unobtrusive, while children lingered at the edges of the courtyard, their wide eyes absorbing the spectacle with quiet fascination. The poet wrote steadily, aware that each moment captured was already slipping toward memory, ephemeral yet eternal once rendered upon paper. By late afternoon, a hush fell across the courtyard. A group of musicians from the southern provinces performed a haunting melody, their flutes weaving together like threads of silk, the notes bending and curling through the air as if alive. The poet's hand moved faster, translating sound into shape, rhythm into line, capturing the intangible essence of music in words. The Lady of Jade Pavilion watched him with a quiet intensity, understanding that this act of translation, of sound into verse, was a sacred form of preservation. As evening approached, lanterns were lit along the corridors, their flames dancing in time with the soft cadence of music still lingering in the courtyard. The emperor stood near the central pond, reflecting on the harmony of the day, observing not only the festival, but the intricate interplay of all who had gathered. The poet closed his scroll, breath held, knowing that he had captured only fragments of what he had witnessed. Yet even fragments were enough to preserve the pulse of the empire, if only in quiet remembrance. The festival concluded with a final piece, a delicate arrangement of flute, zither, and drum, rising and falling like the ebb and flow of a river. Lanterns reflected upon the water, petals drifted from flowering trees, and the courtyard seemed suspended in a perfect balance of sound, light, and shadow. And the poet and the Lady of Jade Pavilion walked slowly through the space, each step deliberate, absorbing the lingering resonance of the music, the ephemeral yet enduring harmony of life. When night fully descended, the city itself seemed to exhale. Lanterns glimmered like distant stars upon the river, and the faint murmur of zither strings echoed in memory rather than in sound. The poet returned to his chamber, carrying scrolls filled with verses inspired by the festival, aware that these moments, like silk and smoke, were fragile, transient, yet infinitely precious. And as the moon rose over Chang'an, bathing the city in silver light, he understood that the Tang Dynasty, vast and enduring, lived not only in power and conquest, but in the quiet, luminous moments of beauty, music, and reflection, waiting for those with eyes and hearts attuned enough to notice. The poet awoke before dawn, the first pale threads of sunlight stretching across his chamber in gentle, hesitant arcs. Outside, Chang'an remained quiet, the city's spires and towers cloaked in a faint mist that hinted at both mystery and promise. Yet even in these hours of solitude, the empire's pulse could be felt, faint but insistent, like the steady beat of a distant drum. Today he had received a rare invitation to travel briefly beyond the walls of the palace toward the western districts where caravans prepared for the Silk Road, that vast network of trade and exchange connecting the Tang Dynasty to lands distant and exotic. The streets were slowly coming to life as he made his way to the western gates. Merchants called softly, their carts laden with silk, spices, and jade, the rich aroma of incense mingling with the scent of exotic resins and herbs. Horses and camels, adorned with intricate trappings of gold and crimson, waited patiently as handlers adjusted harnesses and checked cargo. The air carried a subtle vibration, the quiet hum of preparation for journeys that could last months, even years. Each step along the cobbled streets seemed to echo the countless footsteps that had passed here before. Traders, envoys, poets, travelers, each leaving a trace in memory and time. A caravan master greeted the poet with a curt bow, gesturing toward a collection of camels and horses ready to depart. "The West Road holds more than goods," he said quietly, his voice low. "It carries secrets, messages, and whispers that few ever witness. If you wish to see the empire as it truly breathes, walk carefully and observe closely." The poet nodded, understanding the weight of these words. The Silk Road was more than commerce. It was the artery through which cultures, ideas, and ambitions flowed. Each silk bolt, each jar of incense, each carefully wrapped scroll held not only material value, but also the essence of distant lands, the stories of peoples whose lives might otherwise remain invisible. He mounted a camel, the saddle adjusting to his weight with subtle precision. The caravan began to move, the procession slow and deliberate, winding through streets that gradually gave way to open plains. Fields stretched into the horizon, dotted with farmers beginning their morning toil. Water buffalo wading in shallow rivers, and distant hills that seemed to rise like ancient sentinels guarding the empire's edges. The poet observed silently, capturing in his mind both the grandeur and the subtle poetry of the landscape. The soft shimmer of dawn upon rippling streams, the way mist curled around hilltops like silk threads, the rhythm of labor and life that continued indifferent yet delicate beneath the rising sun. By mid-morning, the caravan reached the western outskirts of the city, where the palace walls gave way to open trade grounds. Merchants from distant lands had already arrived, Persians with embroidered silks and perfumes, Indians carrying spices and rare gems, Sogdians with scrolls of strange writing and tales of distant kingdoms. The air was alive with the murmur of countless tongues, the subtle clash of cultures mingling like a delicate incense that hinted at mystery and adventure. The poet moved quietly among the merchants, observing with careful attention. A Persian trader displayed silks in shades of azure and gold, each bolt patterned with geometric designs that seemed to echo the rhythm of a distant desert wind. An Indian spice merchant offered small pouches of cardamom and cinnamon, their fragrance weaving through the air in faint, heady swirls. A Sogdian traveler unrolled a scroll depicting a caravan crossing a distant mountain range, the illustration alive with motion and shadow, the figures almost breathing within their delicate frames. He paused near a camel laden with woven goods, a leather pouch tied securely upon its back. The master of the caravan approached, his eyes sharp yet patient. "These roads are not merely traveled by merchants," he said softly. "Ambassadors, spies, and envoys move through here, unseen and unnoticed. The goods are often secondary. It is the messages carried, the alliances formed, the eyes that watch and report, that sustain the empire's strength." The poet's gaze shifted, noting the subtle exchanges. The folded note handed under a shawl, the brief touch of hands exchanging coin, the fleeting glance of recognition that passed between strangers. He felt the hum of life, the invisible threads of influence, the delicate network of knowledge and diplomacy that flowed silently along these paths. Here, the Silk Road was not merely a conduit of trade, but a living organism, pulsing with ambition, curiosity, and the imperceptible rhythm of history itself. By late afternoon, the caravan began to prepare for the journey beyond the city. Camels were secured, goods checked, and travelers adjusted their supplies. The poet stood beside a small stream, watching water ripple over smooth stones, feeling the subtle coolness against his palms. He wrote quietly in his scroll, capturing the textures of silk, the shimmer of sunlight on metal, the scent of distant lands mingling with earth and river. Each line of verse sought to preserve both the grandeur and the impermanence of the moment, the fleeting intersection of culture, commerce, and human presence. The lady of Jade Pavilion had arrived quietly beside him, her expression calm yet attentive. "Even here," she whispered, "the empire breathes through whispers, through movement, through the unseen connections that bind distant lands to our walls. Can you feel it? He nodded, penning his observations in careful strokes. He felt the Silk Road as a living pulse, the subtle interplay of ambition, hope, and vulnerability, each thread delicate yet strong, weaving the empire together across deserts, mountains, and rivers. He captured the caravan master's quiet authority, the merchant's careful negotiations, the camel's slow, deliberate tread, and the vast sky stretching endlessly above, a tapestry of life, commerce, and culture unfolding in real time. As twilight approached, the caravan halted beside a small grove of poplar trees, preparing to camp for the night. Lanterns were lit to guide travelers and guard against shadows. Fires crackled softly, the aroma of roasted grains and tea drifting in gentle swirls. Musicians from distant lands played quiet melodies, their notes mingling with the soft murmur of wind through leaves and the gentle murmur of a nearby stream. The poet, seated beside the Lady of Jade Pavilion, allowed the moment to settle within him. He had glimpsed the Silk Road not merely as a route of commerce, but as a living, breathing testament to the empire's reach, its fragility, and its beauty. Here, amidst caravans and lanterns, incense and distant music, he felt the delicate weave of silk and smoke, the threads of connection that sustained Tang life, invisible yet profoundly present, ephemeral yet eternal in memory and verse. Night fell fully, stars glimmering above the western plains, lanterns flickering gently below. The poet closed his scroll ink, drying in the quiet air, and understood with quiet certainty that the empire, for all its grandeur and impermanence, lived as much in the subtle whispers along the Silk Road as in the golden halls of the palace. The golden light of morning had barely touched the walls of Chang. And when rumors began to stir, subtle and insistent, like the first tremors of a distant storm, courtiers whispered in quiet corridors, servants exchanged glances over trays of tea, and even the air seemed to carry tension, as though the palace itself sensed the faint tremor of unrest. The poet, wandering among the gardens, noted the shift immediately, a quiet heaviness that had not been present in days of peace, a shadow moving beneath the brilliance of the Tang sun. By mid-morning, the emperor had convened his council. Word of a brewing rebellion along the empire's northern borders had arrived with urgency, carried by couriers from distant forts and provincial governors. The details were scarce, whispers of unrest, dissatisfaction among military commanders, and villagers whose loyalty was uncertain. Though the emperor maintained a composed exterior, those who watched closely, the poet among them, could see the faint crease of worry upon his brow, the subtle tension in the way he measured his words and gestures. The poet observed quietly, moving among courtiers who discussed strategy, alliances, and contingencies in hushed tones. Every movement seemed deliberate, every word chosen with care, yet beneath the surface, the pulse of fear and anticipation ran like a river, hidden beneath ice. In the courtyard, soldiers drilled with practiced precision, their armor catching the sun, their movements synchronized. Yet, even they could not entirely dispel the sense of unease that had begun to seep into the palace's foundations. He wandered to the Jade Pavilion, seeking solace in the quiet presence of the lady who had become both muse and confidant. She stood among the wisteria and bamboo, her gaze distant, reflecting the faint shadow of anxiety that the palace now carried. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly, not turning to meet his eyes. "The empire shifts beneath its own weight. Change is coming, whether we acknowledge it or not." He nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. The Tang Dynasty had endured centuries of triumph and challenge, yet even the strongest walls and most intricate alliances could not entirely prevent the stirrings of dissent. He felt the delicate threads of silk and smoke that he had come to observe, the subtle balance of power, the imperceptible flow of loyalty, the whispers that could unravel great plans if not heeded. By afternoon, the emperor summoned trusted generals and ministers to the inner halls. Maps were unfurled, strategy discussed, contingencies debated. The poet, observing from the edge of the assembly, noted the careful calculation of each voice. the quiet tension in every measured response. Soldiers and scribes moved like shadows around the periphery, recording decisions, carrying messages, their motions precise yet heavy with unspoken concern. Even in this controlled environment, the air seemed taut with expectation, as though the empire itself held its breath. The Lady of Jade Pavilion appeared again, offering the poet a small cup of tea. "The world outside these walls is rarely as serene as it seems," she said softly. "And yet here, in quiet observation, you can record what others may never see. Perhaps that is our role, not to command, but to witness." He accepted the cup, feeling the warmth seep through his palms. He wrote quickly, quietly translating the tension into verse, the subtle shifts of light upon armor, the way shadows moved along the palace walls, the careful arrangement of officials in council. Each line sought to capture not only events but the underlying currents, the fear, the ambition, the loyalty, and the inevitable uncertainty that wove through the lives of those who held power. By late afternoon, news arrived from the northern provinces. A small town had risen in rebellion, its garrison overtaken, its leaders seized by uncertainty and ambition. The emperor's advisors debated measures, reinforcements, negotiation, demonstration of authority, while the emperor himself remained calm outwardly, masking the storm of calculation beneath a composed exterior. The poet observed silently, understanding that history was being written in these careful decisions, that the fate of thousands depended upon wisdom, timing, and restraint. As dusk approached, the palace grew quieter, the distant echoes of military preparations carrying faintly through the evening air. The Lady of Jade Pavilion walked with the poet along a veranda overlooking the city, lanterns beginning to flicker against the twilight. "Even in moments of turmoil," she said softly, "there is beauty in observation, in understanding. You preserve what might otherwise be lost, the delicate poetry hidden in shadow and smoke." The poet nodded, watching the lantern's light reflected upon jade tiles, rippling like distant stars upon the water. He wrote again, capturing the tension of the day, the disciplined movements of generals, the hushed whispers of ministers, the faint, tremulous glow of lanterns against impending darkness. In his verses, the rebellion became more than conflict. It became a meditation on fragility, loyalty, and the impermanence of power, a subtle echo of silk and smoke woven into the fabric of the Tang Dynasty. Night fell fully, and with it, a quiet sense of waiting descended upon the palace. Soldiers patrolled with measured steps, courtiers lingered in thoughtful silence, and the distant sound of river water flowing beneath stone bridges carried a soothing rhythm that belied the uncertainty of the hours ahead. The emperor retired to his private chambers, leaving the city in a delicate balance, poised between order and disruption, shadow and light. The poet returned to his chamber, lantern casting a warm glow upon paper and ink. He wrote tirelessly, his verses chronicling not only events, but the subtle, unseen forces that shape them, the imperceptible currents of loyalty and fear, ambition and restraint, hope and despair. In capturing these moments, he felt a sense of purpose. Though rebellion might rise and fall, the essence of the empire, its fragile beauty and complexity, could be preserved through careful observation and the quiet art of words. As Chang'an settled into night, the city held its breath, poised on the edge of uncertainty. The poet, brush in hand, understood that the shadows of rebellion were more than threat. They were a reflection of the delicate balance that sustained the empire. And in those quiet moments, he glimpsed the enduring truth of his work: to witness, to record, and to preserve, so that the silken smoke of history might endure even when the world itself trembled. Evening fell upon Chang'an like a slow, deliberate sigh, folding the city into shades of amber and violet. Lanterns glimmered along marble corridors and cobbled streets, their light casting delicate reflections upon the polished jade tiles. Within the palace, a different kind of rhythm stirred, a rhythm woven from silk, song, and whispered laughter. The courtesans, carefully trained in music, poetry, and dance, prepared for the evening performances that had become both ritual and art. Each movement, gesture, and note was deliberate, a practiced display of elegance and subtlety designed to captivate, inspire, and at times, influence. The poet wandered quietly through the eastern wing, ink and scroll tucked beneath his arm. He had come to witness these performances not merely as entertainment, but as a study in the interplay between art and power. The courtesans moved with graceful precision, their robes flowing like water, embroidered with patterns of lotus blossoms, phoenix feathers, and drifting clouds. Hairpins of gold and jade caught the soft lantern light, glinting like distant stars. Every gesture was measured, every glance intentional, a dance of seduction, intellect, and artistry. In the main hall, the emperor awaited, seated upon a raised dais carved from sandalwood and ivory. Courtiers and officials filled the room, their expressions a careful balance of attentiveness and decorum. The musicians took their places, plucking zither strings and drawing soft notes from flutes, while dancers glided across polished floors, their motions blending with the delicate rhythm of the music. The poet, positioned at the periphery, observed not only the performance but the reactions it provoked. The subtle shifts in posture, the faint incline of heads, the quiet exchange of glances. One courtesan, known throughout the palace for her skill in both dance and poetry, performed a solo near the central lantern cluster. Her robe of pale gold shimmered like morning light on a river, and her movements seemed to trace invisible lines in the air, as if drawing poetry from space itself. The poet watched closely, noting the way her gestures echoed the music, how each step carried both elegance and intention. It was a performance designed not only to entertain, but to communicate, to influence, to leave impressions that lingered long after the applause faded. Between performances, courtesans moved among the guests, offering tea and delicate sweets, their smiles subtle and practiced, their eyes carrying the weight of intelligence and observation. They were more than performers. They were observers, messengers, and at times guardians of influence within the palace. The poet recognized in their subtle glances and gestures a deep understanding of human behavior, a mastery of perception that rivaled any strategist's skill. He paused near a small side corridor, where a group of younger courtesans practiced a duet with flutes, their notes intertwined delicately, rising and falling like a gentle wind over distant hills. The poet noted the precision, the patience, the silent discipline that underpinned the apparent ease of their music. He wrote quietly, translating sound into line, movement into verse, capturing both the visible performance and the invisible labor that made it possible. The Lady of Jade Pavilion appeared beside him once more, her expression serene yet thoughtful. "Do you see it?" she asked softly, her voice blending with the faint hum of the hall. "Even in beauty there is power. Even in dance there is observation. The court thrives not only on decisions and decrees, but on subtle influence, on understanding what is unspoken." He nodded, brushing ink across his scroll, capturing not only the dancers and musicians, but the shadows and glances, the silent currents of communication that flowed beneath the ornate masks of decorum. Each line became a reflection of the delicate balance of the court, where artistry and strategy intertwined, where beauty carried meaning beyond what the eye alone could perceive. As the evening deepened, a group of elder courtesans performed a complex ensemble, weaving dance, music, and poetry together in a seamless tapestry. Lanterns reflected upon their flowing robes, creating illusions of motion that seemed almost supernatural, and the poet marveled at the harmony of movement and sound. The emperor's expression was calm yet attentive, a subtle appreciation passing over his features, acknowledging not merely the entertainment but the skill, discipline, and intelligence embedded within the performance. The night air grew cooler as the festival within the hall reached its conclusion. Courtesans moved gracefully through the final formations, their gestures carrying both farewell and lingering resonance, leaving echoes of melody and movement that seemed to float long after the last note faded. The poet, scroll filled with verse, closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the faint scent of incense, lotus and silk mingled in the air. He felt the pulse of the empire in this subtle interplay of art and influence, realizing that the Tang Dynasty, An's strength, lay as much in beauty and culture as in armies and administration. He walked quietly to the veranda overlooking the city, where lanterns reflected upon the river's surface, rippling like fragments of memory. The Lady of Jade Pavilion joined him, holding a small fan carved from sandalwood. "You see the threads," she said, gesturing toward the distant lights. "The subtle threads that bind the empire together. Even in rebellion, in trade, in poetry, in song, there is a pattern, a design that endures if only we recognize it." The poet nodded, aware that the court, with all its elegance, intrigue, and silent power, was another form of storytelling. A narrative in motion, a delicate weave of silk and smoke, of light and shadow, of intent and perception. In recording these moments, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the ephemeral beauty of the Tang court could be preserved, its essence captured in ink and memory for generations to come. As night deepened over Chang'an, the lanterns glimmered like stars, the city exhaling a quiet rhythm of life. The poet returned to his chamber, scrolls and ink in hand, reflecting on the delicate balance of art, influence and observation. In this intricate dance of power and beauty, he understood the true essence of the Tang Dynasty. Vast, luminous, and endlessly intricate, thriving not only in marble halls and gilded palaces, but in the subtle grace of courtesans, musicians, and the quiet observers who recorded it all. The palace awoke in the soft grey of dawn, its towers and corridors steeped in the quiet hush of expectation. Today, the poet was summoned to the Eastern Observatory, a slender tower crowned with gilded eaves and adorned with carvings of constellations and celestial beasts. The emperor's astronomer, a scholar of subtle wisdom and intricate calculation, had requested his presence, not merely to observe, but to witness, to record, and to translate the heavens into verse. The air smelled faintly of polished wood, burning incense, and the crisp tang of metal instruments. The astronomer was a man of quiet precision, robes of deep indigo embroidered with silver stars, his eyes sharp yet contemplative. He greeted the poet with a small nod, leading him to a series of bronze armillary spheres, celestial charts, and astrolabes that gleamed in the soft morning light. Each instrument was a testament to centuries of observation, calculation, and artistry, a delicate marriage of science and craft. "The heavens," the astronomer began, voice low and deliberate, "are more than stars and planets. They are a reflection of the empire, of order and chaos, of time itself. Each movement of the moon, each subtle shift of a constellation, carries meaning, portents, predictions, guidance. To observe them is to understand the rhythm of the world." The poet moved among the instruments, carefully noting their construction, the meticulous inscriptions in small, precise characters, and the polished surfaces reflecting sunlight in gentle arcs. He felt the weight of knowledge concentrated in this observatory, the centuries of careful observation distilled into bronze, wood, and ink. With each glance at the armillary spheres, he perceived not only the movements of the heavens, but the subtle dialogue between human understanding and celestial pattern, a dance of curiosity and interpretation that transcended time. Outside, the city of Chang'an stirred faintly beneath the observatory tower. Merchants began their morning routines. The river glimmered under pale sunlight, and distant mountains appeared like the faint brushstrokes of an artist across the horizon. Yet within the observatory, time seemed to slow each tick of the bronze instruments, each faint adjustment of a celestial sphere carrying a deliberate weight, as if the very rhythm of the universe had been concentrated into this single, sacred space. The emperor arrived mid-morning, his robe a deep crimson threaded with gold dragons coiled around clouds, his presence calm yet commanding. He stood beside the astronomer, observing the instruments with measured attention, asking questions of subtle import, each carefully considered. The poet, seated on a low bench, began to translate these observations into verse, capturing not merely the technical details, but the quiet poetry of observation. The arcs of metal reflecting sunlight like liquid stars, the way shadows shifted across polished floors, the subtle breath of the city beyond the windows. The astronomer pointed toward the northern sky, where faint patterns of stars formed shapes both familiar and mysterious. The position of these stars, he said softly, suggests the alignment of fortune for the coming season. Rivers may flood, harvests may flourish, alliances may shift. To understand the heavens is to glimpse the subtle currents that shape human life. The poet wrote steadily, ink flowing like a quiet river across his scroll. He described the polished bronze spheres, the engraved constellations, the gentle creak of wood as instruments were adjusted, the soft rustle of robes and paper. Each detail became a reflection, not only of observation, but of interpretation, the subtle interplay of human knowledge and the vast, unknowable expanse of the cosmos. By afternoon, the emperor retired briefly, leaving the poet and astronomer to continue their study. The astronomer guided him to a small telescope, an instrument recently acquired from distant lands, its lens catching the faint glimmer of sunlight and magnifying distant stars and planets. The poet peered through the lens, awed by the delicate perfection of the heavens. Planets circling, stars shimmering, the silent dance of celestial bodies unfolding with an elegance both precise and immeasurable. The cosmos is vast, the astronomer whispered. Yet each movement reflects something of ourselves, our ambitions, our fears, our triumphs. To observe is to understand, and to understand is to preserve. The poet translated this understanding into verse, each line tracing the path of stars, the arc of planets, the faint shimmer of distant nebulae. He captured the delicate tension between permanence and impermanence, the fragile beauty of knowledge glimpsed in fleeting moments, and the subtle connection between human endeavor and cosmic rhythm. As evening fell, the observatory was bathed in a soft glow of lanterns, the instruments gleaming faintly in the shifting light. The emperor returned, silent and contemplative, and together they observed the first stars of night emerging against the deepening sky. Lanterns from the palace reflected upon the river, distant bells chimed from temples, and the city exhaled into night. The poet, brush in hand, felt the delicate pulse of history, the subtle convergence of human ambition, artistic preservation, and the eternal rhythm of the heavens. By nightfall, the observations had been recorded, the instruments carefully adjusted for future study. The poet walked quietly through the palace gardens, lanterns reflecting in gentle ripples across small ponds, the Lady of Jade Pavilion waiting nearby. "You have captured the rhythm of the cosmos," she said softly, her gaze reflecting the first glimmers of starlight. "Not in calculation alone, but in observation, in understanding, in memory preserved. This is the essence of our time, delicate, fleeting, yet enduring through witness and verse." The poet, seated beneath a blooming plum tree, dipped his brush in ink and wrote, the faint fragrance of blossoms mingling with the scent of lanterns and incense. He recorded the motion of stars, the play of light on polished bronze, the subtle presence of human thought observing the infinite. In these lines, he preserved not merely the knowledge of the astronomer, but the delicate interplay between observation and understanding, between the vastness of the cosmos and the intimate pulse of the Tang Dynasty. Night deepened over Chang'an, the city silent but alive beneath moonlight and lantern glow. The observatory stood like a sentinel of knowledge, a bridge between the empire and the heavens. And the poet understood that the work of observation, whether of stars, courtiers, or caravans, was both eternal and fleeting, a delicate thread woven into the silk and smoke of history itself. The poet awoke to the faint sound of hooves against cobbled streets, a rhythmic echo that carried through the quiet corridors of the palace. Couriers from the western provinces had arrived, their horses tired but alert, bearing messages wrapped in oiled silk and sealed with wax imprinted with provincial insignias. The air carried the scent of distant deserts, faint dust mingling with the cool morning breeze drifting through open verandas. These messages were rare, fragile threads from the edges of the empire, and each one carried both information and a subtle weight, the hopes, fears, and ambitions of people living far from the gilded halls of Chang'an. The emperor convened his council early, the courtiers moving quickly to arrange documents, scrolls, and maps across polished tables. The poet observed quietly, noting the tension beneath the careful calm that the officials projected. Each report contained fragments of unrest, details of trade, notes on local alliances, and whispers of discontent. The western provinces had always been difficult to govern, expansive, diverse, distant, and yet they were vital to the empire's prosperity. Silk, jade, spices, horses, and precious minerals flowed along the western roads, linking distant lands through both commerce and diplomacy. A courier stepped forward, unrolling a scroll with meticulous care. The writing, elegant and precise, detailed skirmishes between local garrisons and bandits who had exploited unrest to seize territory. Villagers were caught between loyalties, some pledging allegiance to the empire, others aligning with forces whose names carried the faintest echoes of rebellion. The poet traced the lines with his eyes, absorbing not only the facts, but the subtle patterns, the ebb and flow of human ambition, the quiet vulnerability of distant communities, and the invisible threads connecting events hundreds of miles from the imperial heart. The emperor listened attentively, fingers steepled, his gaze steady yet thoughtful. Advisors spoke in measured tones, discussing reinforcements, negotiations, and the strategic placement of troops. Maps were unfurled, their inked rivers and mountain ranges reflecting the painstaking care of cartographers who had traveled across harsh terrain. The poet's hand moved silently across his own scroll, recording the interplay of strategy and human emotion. The fear and courage of those living at the Empire's frontier, the subtle calculation of generals, the quiet gravity of the emperor himself. By mid-morning, the poet was led to the eastern veranda where the Lady of Jade Pavilion awaited. She had received news of the western disturbances earlier, her expression calm but lined with concern. "The empire extends not merely through walls and gates," she said softly, her voice blending with the distant murmur of the city below. "It breathes through these provinces, through the loyalty and courage of those who walk paths far beyond our view. The whispers you record, they are as vital as any decree or command." The poet nodded, ink poised over paper. He wrote of caravans delayed by banditry, of village elders negotiating with armed factions, of soldiers marching through dust-choked roads beneath the relentless sun. He described markets where traders spoke in hushed tones, fearing raids, temples where monks offered prayers for safety and harvest, and small fortresses perched on rocky outcrops, their flags fluttering like fragile promises against the vastness of the western sky. Each scene was a delicate weave of human determination and vulnerability, a living testament to the empire's reach and the precariousness of its authority. By afternoon, reports turned to trade. Merchants from distant lands had arrived in provincial towns, their goods both coveted and rare. Persian silks dyed in colors that shimmered like dawn, Indian spices that filled the air with warmth and depth, and jade and turquoise carved into shapes that seemed to capture light itself. Yet even these treasures could not dispel tension. The movement of goods mirrored the movement of power, and the empire's pulse was felt most acutely in the quiet negotiation of loyalty and survival. The poet observed a caravan that had paused near a small oasis, camels kneeling as handlers adjusted loads, merchants speaking softly in the shadow of tents. The oasis, a green jewel amid a sea of arid plains, seemed to breathe life into weary travelers. He captured the scene in verse. The shimmer of heat above the sands, the play of sunlight on water, the delicate interactions between trader and soldier, villager and envoy. Even in the vast, unforgiving landscape, the subtle threads of connection persisted, binding the distant provinces to Chang'an in ways both visible and invisible. As dusk approached, the emperor reviewed further reports, his gaze sweeping across the maps and messages, like a hawk observing the expanse below. Decisions were made, troops dispatched along critical routes, envoys sent to negotiate, resources allocated to support both defense and diplomacy. The poet noted the quiet efficiency with which the emperor translated information into action, the silent interplay between knowledge, authority, and foresight that allowed the empire to endure. Night fell upon Chang'an, lanterns flickering along palace corridors, the distant mountains shrouded in shadow. The poet closed his scroll, ink drying in the cool evening air, and felt the weight of what he had witnessed. The western provinces, though distant, were alive with the pulse of human ambition, courage, and fear. Each whisper, each movement, each choice, recorded in careful observation, was a reflection of the delicate balance that sustained the empire. The Lady of Jade Pavilion joined him as he descended the eastern staircase. "You have captured the voices of the West," she said softly, her gaze fixed upon the horizon where the last light lingered. "Even from here, you can sense the rhythm of their lives, their fears, and their hopes. This is history preserved, not in stone, but in awareness, in memory, and in verse." The poet nodded, lanterns casting faint reflections upon polished marble as he returned to his chamber. He wrote late into the night, ink flowing in measured strokes, capturing caravans, desert winds, distant mountains, and the subtle interplay of power and humanity that stretched across miles. In his verses, the Silk Road and its western provinces were more than territory. They were living stories, threads in the vast tapestry of the Tang Dynasty, delicate and resilient, ephemeral and enduring, woven into the silk and smoke of history itself. The early morning mist draped itself across the palace gardens, curling around the meticulously pruned pines and delicate plum blossoms like ethereal ribbons of smoke. In the jade garden, pathways of smooth jade stones meandered between koi-filled ponds, small bridges arching over shimmering waters that reflected the rising sun in fractured patterns. Here, the poet often wandered, seeking both inspiration and observation, and today was no different, except that the garden seemed unusually alive, as if the plants and stones themselves held secrets waiting to be uncovered. A soft rustle among the bamboo drew his attention. There, half hidden behind a cluster of blossoms, a courtesan he had not seen before moved with quiet precision, her movements measured, almost ritualistic. Her robes, a blend of pale green and silver, mirrored the hues of the garden itself. She carried a small lacquered box, its surface intricately carved with dragonflies and lotus flowers. Her expression was calm, yet guarded, the faintest glint of intelligence in her eyes, as if she were aware that the poet's gaze was more than casual observation. He approached slowly, mindful of the delicate serenity of the scene. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice barely disturbing the whisper of leaves. The courtesan inclined her head slightly. "Good morning, poet. The Jade Garden holds many stories, though few choose to listen. Some are spoken aloud, others are preserved in silence." Her tone was calm, yet carried the weight of subtle warning, and the poet sensed immediately that this was no ordinary interaction. She opened the lacquered box, revealing a collection of small scrolls, each tied with silk cords, in colors that seemed to shimmer even in soft morning light. "These are records," she explained quietly. "Messages, poems, observations, fragments of life from those who walk through the palace and beyond. They are the whispers that history almost forgot, the delicate threads between ambition and secrecy, loyalty and betrayal." The poet's hands itched to touch the scrolls, yet he paused, aware of the delicate trust implicit in the gesture. She allowed him a single scroll, bound in violet silk. As he unrolled it, inked lines revealed not only poetry, but subtle accounts of political intrigue, secret alliances, and the intricate negotiations that occurred away from the gaze of the emperor. It was a glimpse into the hidden architecture of power, the quiet maneuvering that ensured the stability of the empire even in moments of uncertainty. The courtesan moved closer to a pond, tossing a small pebble into the water. Ripples spread in concentric patterns, reflecting sunlight like liquid jade. "Power," she said softly, "is rarely what it appears. Here, in gardens, in music, in whispered verse, it is observed, manipulated, and preserved. The emperor sees the grand structure, but the threads beneath are invisible to all but a few." The poet read carefully, inked words leaping into memory as he absorbed the details. He recorded not merely the events, but the atmosphere, the faint scent of lotus and incense, the glimmer of sunlight on jade stones, the distant murmur of water trickling over carved channels. Each line of verse became a reflection of subtle tension, a meditation on the invisible forces shaping the palace, the empire, and the very rhythm of life within the walls of Chang'an. By late morning, the Lady of Jade Pavilion appeared, her expression calm yet edged with curiosity. She observed the scrolls and the interaction with a quiet knowing. "You are witnessing the hidden layers," she said softly, gesturing toward the courtesan and the garden's serene expanse. "These are the stories that often go unrecorded, yet they define the shape of power." To understand the Tang Dynasty fully, one must perceive not only the visible splendor, but the concealed currents beneath. The poet nodded, returning the scrolls to the lacquered box with reverence. He noted how even the smallest gestures, the tilt of a head, the subtle movement of robes, the placement of a foot upon jade stones, carried meaning. In this garden, life and influence intertwined, every detail deliberate, every motion a note in an unseen symphony of diplomacy, loyalty, and observation. As afternoon approached, the courtesan guided the poet to a secluded alcove overlooking a small cascade. The water fell in delicate sheets, pooling in jade-colored basins carved centuries earlier. "Some stories," she whispered, "cannot leave this garden. They are preserved here, in silence, in observation, in the memory of those who understand. But others, like yours, must travel. You record, you witness, you preserve. In ink, these secrets may reach beyond the walls, and perhaps endure." The poet set his scroll upon a stone bench, dipping his brush into ink. He wrote quickly, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, water and stone, sound and silence. He translated the unspoken language of gestures, the faint aroma of flowers, the delicate positioning of figures within the garden, into lines that shimmered with both observation and understanding. Each word became a bridge between secrecy and history, a careful testament to the hidden life of the palace and the subtle elegance that sustained it. Evening descended softly upon the jade garden, lanterns igniting with a warm golden glow. Shadows stretched across the stone pathways, water rippled in gentle undulations, and the soft murmur of distant voices blended with the faint hum of insects beginning their nightly chorus. The poet paused, looking across the serene expanse, sensing the delicate weave of influence, secrecy, and beauty that sustained the empire. The courtesan disappeared among the bamboo and blossoms, leaving the poet alone with his thoughts and his ink. The Lady of Jade Pavilion lingered for a moment, her gaze distant, reflecting both the serenity and the subtle power embedded within the garden. "Remember," she said softly, "even beauty can carry truth, and even silence can preserve history." The poet, brush in hand, continued to write into the night, capturing every detail: the shimmer of moonlight on jade, the ripple of water, the faint scent of plum blossoms, the delicate movements of figures in shadows. In these verses, the jade garden became both sanctuary and archive, a repository of secrets and subtleties, of whispers and observation, woven into the ever-expanding tapestry of the Tang Dynasty. As Chang'an settled into deep night, the gardens exhaled a quiet, enduring rhythm. The poet, seated beneath a flowering plum tree, understood with clarity that history was preserved not only in grand battles, imperial decrees, or the march of armies, but in gardens, whispers, and the silent observation of those attuned to the empire's hidden threads. Here, amid jade stones and cascading water, silk and smoke intertwined, eternal and delicate, as enduring as memory itself. Far to the west, where the desert sands rolled like golden waves beneath an endless sky, Dunhuang stood as a vital jewel along the Silk Road. Oasis-fed canals shimmered under the blazing sun, walls of mud brick and stone rising like quiet sentinels over bustling streets. Merchants moved with purpose, their caravans laden with silk, jade, spices, and glassware from lands both near and distant. Each item a testament to the empire's vast reach. Here, Trade was not mere commerce. It was the lifeblood connecting Chang'an to the outer provinces, weaving together distant cultures into the Tang tapestry. The merchant prince, a man both shrewd and urbane, walked among his merchants, his long robe fluttering in the wind, embroidered with patterns of clouds and phoenixes that spoke of wealth and lineage. He was a master of networks, alliances, and negotiation, and his presence alone commanded attention. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the movements of traders, guards, and envoys, noting subtle shifts in demeanor, the faint hesitation of a courier, the careful placement of goods upon camelback. Each observation carried meaning, profit, loyalty, or potential treachery. The poet, traveling alongside an imperial envoy, had arrived to witness the intricate web of trade and diplomacy in Dunhuang. From the moment he entered the city, he sensed the vibrancy of life in every market stall, caravan corridor, and narrow alleyway. The air was thick with the sense of spices and dust, sandalwood and cooking fires, mingling with the faint metallic tang of coin. Merchants shouted prices in a chorus of languages, haggling and negotiating, while couriers hurried with urgent messages tied with silk cords, some from the imperial capital, others from distant kingdoms. The merchant prince welcomed the poet with a faint bow and a discerning glance. "You are not merely here to see wealth or commerce," he said, voice smooth as flowing water. "You are here to witness the rhythm of connection, the way trust, ambition, and knowledge traverse mountains and deserts, linking distant lands to the empire's heart." They walked together through the main bazaar, a labyrinth of wooden stalls covered with colorful canopies. Persian silks shimmered under the sun, Indian spices perfumed the air, and Chinese ceramics gleamed like pale moons upon carved tables. The poet noted every detail, the way merchants displayed goods to catch the light, the careful gestures of bargaining, the subtle hierarchy of traders, guards, and assistants. He wrote, brush flowing across paper, capturing not merely the visual spectacle, but the undercurrent of strategy, negotiation, and influence. By midday, the merchant prince led the poet to a small private courtyard where envoys from distant kingdoms awaited. The courtyard was serene, fountains trickling among flowering apricot trees, carpets of embroidered silk spread across polished stone. Here, deals were struck with quiet efficiency, alliances forged through subtle exchange of gifts, gestures, and words. The poet observed the subtle choreography, the slight incline of a head, the measured placing of a hand upon a ledger, the faintest nod indicating agreement or concession. Each action carried meaning, each pause was deliberate. The merchant prince explained the delicate balance he maintained. "These provinces," he said, "are far from the capital, yet they are vital. One misstep, an insult, a delayed caravan, an unfair trade, can unravel months of effort. Here, wealth is entwined with diplomacy, survival, and the empire's image. Every decision resonates far beyond these walls." The poet recorded meticulously, capturing the interplay of sun and shadow across the courtyard, the ripple of fountains, the delicate fragrance of blossoms mingling with dust and spice. He wrote of merchants bowing and smiling, of envoys whispering behind fans, of guards watching with quiet alertness, and of the merchant prince's serene yet commanding presence, a figure balancing ambition, strategy, and grace with the subtle skill of a tightrope walker. By afternoon, the poet followed the caravan routes beyond the city walls, where camels trudged through desert sands beneath a sky vast and unbroken. Distant mountains shimmered in the heat, mirages flickering like silk ribbons across the horizon. Merchants and guards moved with practiced precision, their survival dependent on vigilance, knowledge of the terrain, and trust in each other. The poet observed, ink capturing the rhythm of the desert, the sway of camelbacks, the glint of sunlight on metal amulets, the occasional burst of laughter or song among travelers. The merchant prince rode alongside, eyes scanning the horizon. "The desert teaches patience," he said quietly, voice almost lost in the wind. "It teaches observation, understanding, and the value of subtlety. A misread sign, a misjudged route, or a misplaced word can bring ruin. Just as in the court, So in the caravan, the unseen threads of influence and action determine the fate of many. As evening approached, the caravan paused near an oasis, the water reflecting the deepening colors of sunset. Lanterns were lit along the pathways, casting golden reflections upon sand and water. Merchants prepared meals, camels drank deeply, and the poet wrote as twilight fell, translating the interplay of light, movement, and human intent into verse. He captured the vastness of the desert and the intricate human network that traversed it, the way commerce, loyalty, and survival intertwined seamlessly. Night descended fully, stars emerging in brilliant clarity above. The Milky Way stretched like a silver ribbon across the sky. The poet felt the subtle hum of history in motion, a rhythm carried from Chang'an to Dunhuang, and beyond, a thread connecting emperors, courtiers, courtesans, merchants, and travelers. Here, amid sand and silk, spice and jade, the empire's heartbeat was tangible, alive in every caravan, every whispered negotiation, every careful choice. The merchant prince stood beside him, gazing at the sky. "You see now," he said softly, "why the Silk Road exists not merely for trade, but for connection, for influence, for the weaving of stories that span empires. These threads, like yours, preserve what might otherwise be lost, and in doing so, they ensure that history, even distant from the capital, endures." The poet, brush poised above his scroll, dipped it in ink and wrote into the night, capturing not only the desert and its people, but the subtle dance of power, loyalty, and survival that sustained an empire. In the caravan, in the oasis, and beneath the vast stars, he witnessed the fragile and enduring beauty of human endeavor, recorded in verse that would carry the Silk Road stories across time. Autumn descended upon Chang'an like a golden whisper, cool wind stirring the silk banners that hung from palace eaves, and ginkgo leaves drifting across marble courtyards in waves of yellow flame. Within the imperial city, preparations had begun for a grand banquet, one of the most splendid celebrations of Emperor Xuanzong's reign. The announcement spread through the capital like a sweet perfume, filling streets and tea houses with anticipation. Poets rehearsed verses, musicians tuned their instruments, and cooks sharpened their knives, all knowing that this feast would not merely be a meal, but a declaration of the empire's glory. The palace itself transformed for the occasion. Gardens were pruned and watered until every petal gleamed, ponds cleared so that lanterns would shimmer upon their still surfaces. Along the jade steps leading to the Hall of Everlasting Harmony, eunuchs and servants worked tirelessly, arranging vast arrangements of chrysanthemums, preparing lacquered tables, polishing silver goblets, and unfurling banners embroidered with dragons and clouds. The air smelled faintly of incense, sandalwood, and plum blossom, and beyond the great bronze gates, the sounds of rehearsal drifted faintly. The gentle pluck of the pipa, the distant echo of drums, the soft hum of court singers perfecting their notes. The poet, now a favored guest of the imperial household, was invited to attend. He stood in the outer courtyard as the sun descended, its last light gilding the tiled roofs in molten gold. The air held the faint chill of approaching dusk, and above, the palace lamps flickered to life one by one, their glow spreading like captured starlight. Around him, courtiers arrived in robes of shimmering silk, jade, coral, indigo, and snow white, each bearing gifts or scrolls, each carefully rehearsing words of flattery and praise. As the bronze doors opened, music flooded the courtyard. Flutes and zithers intertwined in liquid harmony as the guests entered the Hall of Everlasting Harmony. The ceiling arched high above, painted with celestial scenes of dragons chasing pearls, phoenixes soaring among clouds, and constellations arranged to mirror the heavens themselves. Silk curtains rippled in the gentle breeze of hidden fans, carrying with them the scent of rare flowers imported from distant Yunnan and beyond. At the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy of golden gauze, the emperor sat upon his throne, serene and radiant. Xuanzong's face bore the calm assurance of one who had known both conquest and peace, his gaze thoughtful, yet penetrating. At his side sat Yang Guifei, the beloved consort whose beauty was said to rival moonlight on still water. Her gown shimmered with the pale gleam of pearls, and when she turned her head, her earrings caught the light like drops of dew. The poet was ushered to a place near the lower dais, among scholars and musicians. Servants moved gracefully between the tables, bearing trays of delicacies, steamed river fish glazed with honey, duck roasted in 5 spices, bowls of rice fragrant with lotus seeds and jujubes, and cups of plum wine that glowed like amber. The hum of conversation rose, punctuated by laughter and the occasional clink of jade cups. As the emperor raised his hand, the hall fell silent. His voice, calm and clear, carried through the air. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate not merely the bounty of our land, but the harmony that sustains it. From the deserts of the west to the seas of the east, from scholars in their halls to farmers in their fields, all serve under heaven's order. Let music and poetry remind us that the empire's strength lies not in conquest alone, but in unity and the cultivation of beauty." A murmur of approval rippled through the hall. At a signal, the musicians began to play. The melody rose like morning mist, delicate and dreamlike, the notes weaving through air thick with candlelight and perfume. Dancers stepped forth, their movements fluid and deliberate, silk sleeves swirling like painted clouds. The poet felt the rhythm sink into him, the precision of each gesture, the unspoken language of balance and grace. He thought of the empire itself as a dance. One misstep, and the illusion of harmony would falter, but in its perfection lay transcendence. Then came the recitations. Poets stood, one by one, offering verses praising the emperor's virtue, the consort's beauty, the abundance of autumn, and the peace of the realm. When it came to his turn, the poet rose, holding his scroll lightly in trembling hands. The court quieted. He began softly, voice steady but low, his words flowing like ink across parchment. Golden leaves fall upon jade steps, lanterns tremble in the breath of dusk. Beneath heaven's gaze, men gather in splendor to praise the peace that blooms from wisdom's seed. A hush lingered after his final line. Then slowly, applause spread, murmured at first, then growing louder. Even the emperor inclined his head slightly, a faint smile gracing his lips. "Your words," he said, "carry the calm of autumn and the grace of spring. The empire remembers through poets what deeds alone cannot hold." Yang Guifei turned her gaze upon the poet, her expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw melancholy behind her serenity, a hint of knowledge that beauty, like power, was as fragile as the petal of a plum blossom in the wind. She raised her cup, and he bowed deeply in return. The feast continued long into the night. Fire dancers spun flames in spirals, acrobats leapt and twirled beneath the vaulted ceiling, and the emperor's laughter mingled with the soft music of strings. Outside, moonlight silvered the palace roofs, and the gardens shimmered like a dream reflected in water. The poet slipped away to the terrace for air, standing beneath the night sky as autumn's wind stirred his robes. From this vantage, he saw the city stretched below, Chang'an, heart of the empire, vast and luminous. He could hear faintly the sounds of distant drums and the laughter of revelers, yet even as he admired the splendor, he felt an ache beneath it all, a whisper of fragility, as though the empire's brilliance was a candle flickering against an encroaching dark. Inside, the banquet continued, but the poet lingered alone. He dipped his brush into ink and began to write by moonlight, not a praise poem, but a reflection of fleeting glory, of beauty bound to impermanence, of the emperor's calm and the consort's quiet sorrow. For he sensed, though none dared say it, that the empire's greatest splendor was also the beginning of its slow unraveling. The music swelled once more, echoing faintly through the halls, carrying with it both triumph and melancholy. The poet closed his eyes, listening, and thought how even in perfection there is always the first note of loss. Night had settled over Chang'an like a silken shroud. lanterns flickering softly along the winding pathways of the palace gardens, their golden light reflected in pools of water surrounded by lotus blooms. The Lotus Pavilion, a secluded structure of carved teak and jade inlaid with mother of pearl, stood at the heart of the eastern garden, framed by willows that swayed in the gentle breeze. Here, the air was thick with the fragrance of lotus and sandalwood, mingling with the faint smoke of burning incense. In this quiet sanctuary, secrets found their refuge. The poet walked slowly across the marble bridge leading to the pavilion, the wooden planks beneath his feet emitting a soft, hollow echo. Inside, silk drapes rustled with movement, and the faint glow of lanterns illuminated the delicate inlays on the polished floor. Courtiers and attendants had long departed, leaving only a few figures who lingered for whispered counsel and confidential messages. The emperor's scholars often convened here, but tonight it was different. The air seemed charged with unspoken tension, the soft murmur of secrets waiting to be shared. The Lady of Jade Pavilion awaited him, her expression serene yet unreadable. She gestured toward a low table set with tea and delicate porcelain cups. "Some matters," she said softly, "cannot be carried on scrolls or ink alone. They require presence, discretion, and understanding. You are to observe, not only with eyes but with insight." The poet bowed, mindful of the gravity in her tone. He poured tea carefully, the steam rising in delicate spirals, the faint fragrance mingling with the lotus-scented air. Beyond the pavilion, the garden's ponds reflected the moon, the petals of white and pink lotus trembling as the night breeze stirred them. Every detail seemed laden with meaning. The flicker of a shadow, the tilt of a head, the ripple of water across stone. A courier appeared from the eastern corridor, a small scroll pressed tightly in his hand. He bowed, voice low and urgent. "For your attention, lady," he said. She unrolled it with care, eyes scanning the inked lines, lips pressing together thoughtfully. The poet noted the subtle shift in her posture, the faint tightening of her fingers as she digested the message. This was not mere correspondence. It was the pulse of intrigue, the delicate balance of alliances, rivalries, and influence. "The western provinces report unrest," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Local governors contend with banditry, shifting loyalties, and merchants whose allegiances are fragile. These whispers travel slowly to the capital, yet they shape decisions made here in Chang'an. And yet," she added, turning to him with a faint, measured smile, "you will see how influence moves quietly, like ripples across a still pond." The poet observed silently as she summoned two attendants. They brought a series of small objects, jade seals, folded letters, and inked tokens, each bearing subtle symbols of authority, trust, or warning. In this space, the exchange of even a single object carried immense weight. A misplaced seal could spell misunderstanding. A misread symbol could provoke tension. Here, the Empire's invisible threads were most delicately woven. A shadow moved across the pavilion's doorway, and a figure entered, hooded and silent. The lady nodded once, welcoming the visitor without words. The figure unrolled a narrow scroll, revealing delicate calligraphy detailing negotiations between a provincial governor and a local tribal leader. Each sentence carried nuance, word choice, emphasis, and even the spacing of characters hinted at loyalty or deception. The poet leaned closer, ink ready, capturing every subtlety. The sway of the figure's robe, the measured tilt of the head, the soft exhale before each line of recitation. They spoke in hushed tones, voices barely above the rustle of silk and the soft trickle of the lotus pond outside. The poet translated in his mind, recording not just facts, but the delicate tension underlying every word. A word left unspoken could be as powerful as one inked in bold characters. Alliances were fragile, loyalty fragile, and understanding required both patience and perception. The lady gestured toward the poet, a faint glint in her eyes. "Observe the subtleties," she said. "It is not only what is said, but what is implied, not only what is given, but what is withheld. These are the currents beneath the empire. the hidden patterns that guide both action and history. Outside, the moonlight shifted across the garden, illuminating the curves of the pavilion, the ripples on the water, and the delicate petals of the lotus. The poet's brush moved across his scroll, capturing each gesture, each nuance, the weight of presence, the power of silence. He wrote of whispered agreements sealed with subtle nods, of coded messages hidden in plain sight, of courtiers navigating a web of influence as intricate as the designs inlaid into the pavilion floor. Time passed almost imperceptibly. The courtiers departed, leaving the lady and the poet alone. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Remember," she said, "history is often preserved in silence. The grand deeds are recorded, but the whispers, the subtle movements, the quiet choices, these shape what is remembered and what is forgotten. You must listen to the silence as carefully as to the words." The poet bowed deeply, inked scroll in hand. Lanterns reflected in the pond, petals drifting silently upon the surface, the soft murmur of the garden harmonizing with the distant city. He understood that the Lotus Pavilion was not merely a place of beauty, but a repository of influence and observation, a space where power moved delicately, silently, and imperceptibly. Night deepened, and he remained for a while longer, observing the garden, the moonlight, and the subtle play of shadow and reflection. Each detail, the tilt of a lantern, the ripple of water, the swaying of a lotus stem, was a note in the hidden symphony of the empire. He recorded it all, knowing that these whispers, though fleeting, would endure in his verses, preserving the delicate balance of secrecy, diplomacy, and insight that sustained the Tang Dynasty. As he finally left the pavilion, the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, brushing gold across the city. He felt the weight of observation, the quiet authority of what had been witnessed, and the enduring power of the subtle, the whispers that shaped history, even as the empire slept beneath moonlight and lotus blooms. The city of Chang'an shimmered under a sky thick with stars. But tonight, even the celestial lights paled beside the brilliance of the Festival of Lanterns. Streets and canals were alive with movement. Lanterns of silk, paper, and carved wood swung from poles, floated atop the waterways, and hung from the eaves of every merchant's home. Red, gold, and jade hues danced across the cityscape, reflecting in puddles left from recent rain, creating the illusion that the very earth was alight. Music drifted from every courtyard, mingling with laughter, the soft lapping of water, and the occasional crackle of distant fireworks. The poet moved slowly along the main thoroughfare, brush and scroll carefully tucked beneath his robes, taking in the spectacle with a practiced eye. Street performers juggled flaming torches, acrobats twirled atop wooden poles, and masked dancers swayed in rhythm to the beating of drums. Merchants called to one another in vibrant languages, offering candied fruits, spiced teas, and delicate lanterns painted with dragons, phoenixes, and celestial motifs. Every interaction was a note in the symphony of the festival, a fleeting brushstroke in a citywide painting alive with color, sound, and human fervor. In the central square, the emperor had erected a grand pavilion, its roof tiled in gold and adorned with dragons of gilded bronze. Courtiers, scholars, and officials gathered beneath it, robes fluttering, fans opening and closing in measured gestures. Xuanzong himself sat beneath an embroidered canopy, the faint gleam of jade and pearl reflecting in his eyes as he watched the celebrations with quiet satisfaction. Beside him, Yang Guifei's presence radiated serenity, her hand resting lightly upon her lap, her gaze following the dancers with subtle, elegant attention. The poet approached the pavilion carefully, invited to observe the festivities from a privileged vantage point. As he settled on a low stone bench, a flotilla of lanterns released onto the river caught his attention. Paper and silk, each containing a small candle, drifted along the currents, flickering in reflection as if the river itself were carrying messages to the heavens. Children ran along the riverbanks, pointing and laughing, their faces illuminated by the glow of floating light. The poet made careful notes, not merely of sight but of mood, the gentle sigh of water, the distant hum of conversation, the almost imperceptible tension between joy and solemnity that lingered beneath the celebration. Musicians began a procession, playing zithers, flutes and drums in a deliberate cadence that echoed across the square. The poet noted how rhythm moved through the crowd like a tangible force, guiding gestures, expressions, and even breathing. Dancers emerged from the pavilion, their silk sleeves trailing like comet tails, their masks depicting mythical creatures whose eyes seemed to follow spectators. The emperor's smile was faint but genuine, the corners of his eyes crinkling in satisfaction. Yang Guifei's laughter, soft and melodic, mingled with the music, drawing the poet's attention to subtle gestures. A tilt of the head, the graceful lift of a hand, a fleeting glance exchanged between performers and observers that spoke of unspoken stories. At the far side of the square, lantern sellers moved quietly, displaying intricate designs depicting scenes from distant lands, deserts of the western provinces, lush gardens along the southern rivers, snowy peaks of the northern frontiers. The poet paused to study one, a depiction of camels moving through a golden desert beneath an immense moon. It reminded him of Dunhuang, of caravans traversing endless sands, and the subtle rhythms of commerce and diplomacy that sustained the empire's heartbeat. He sketched it quickly, capturing light and shadow, movement and stillness, in lines that might preserve its essence beyond the festival's night. As evening deepened, fireworks erupted along the city walls, bursts of crimson, violet, and emerald painting the sky in transient grandeur. The crowd gasped and cheered. The emperor inclined his head in appreciation, and Yang Guifei's eyes shone like twin moons beneath the delicate light of the lanterns. The poet brush poised over his scroll translated the spectacle into lines that mingled observation with emotion. The ephemeral beauty of fire against the permanence of stone, the fleeting joy of revelers against the enduring weight of empire, the delicate interplay of light, shadow, and human presence. Later, beneath a canopy of hanging lanterns in the imperial garden, the emperor's ministers exchanged hushed words. The poet listened, recording gestures, pauses, and the subtle language of influence. A hand brushing a silk sleeve, a careful placement of a foot, a glance that conveyed more than speech. Here, even amid celebration, the machinery of governance continued quietly, silently, threading together the empire's vast complexity. By midnight, the festival reached its quietude. The streets emptied slowly as lanterns were extinguished, flames dying into soft shadows. The river carried the last flotilla of candles into darkness, their reflections trembling until the waters absorbed them entirely. The poet remained in the garden, inhaling the cool night air, listening to distant murmurs, feeling the pulse of Chang'an beneath the lantern-lit calm. He thought of the empire as a living organism, its rhythm captured in festivals and whispers, in trade and diplomacy, in poetry and song. Even in revelry, even in beauty, there existed subtle undercurrents, reminders of fragility, ambition, and the delicate balance that sustained civilization. The Festival of Lanterns was more than celebration. It was a reflection of human aspiration, a ritual of unity, a meditation on light and shadow that endured long after flames had faded. As the poet finally rose to leave, he glimpsed the emperor and consort one last time beneath the pale glow of a lantern-strewn arbor. Their figures seemed suspended between reality and legend, guardians of a world both radiant and fragile. He returned to his quarters, scroll in handbrush, moving steadily, translating the ephemeral into permanence. The music, the laughter, the shadows and the silken threads of memory, into a record that would endure beyond the night, beyond the festival, beyond even the fleeting grandeur of the empire itself. Winter arrived in Chang'an with a brittle clarity, the northern winds slicing through the city streets, rattling paper lanterns, and carrying the faint tang of snow from distant mountains. The air had grown sharper, heavier with unease, and whispers circulated through the palace corridors. Rumors of unrest in distant provinces, of governors clashing with local militias, of bandits emboldened by political distraction. Even the emperor's court, accustomed to the rhythm of subtle intrigue, sensed a change in the current of power, a prelude to upheaval that could disturb the fragile balance of the empire. The poet, walking along the northern corridors of the palace, noticed the shift immediately. Servants moved with quieter haste. Eunuchs lingered near doors as if listening for faint threats. And courtiers, usually meticulous in their composure, exchanged glances with almost imperceptible tension. In the Hall of Everlasting Harmony, ministers whispered behind folds of silk, discussing reports from the frontier, each voice lowered as if fear itself had weight. The emperor, aware of the mounting unease, maintained his calm, yet even the faintest furrow in his brow betrayed the burden of ruling an empire teetering on the cusp of instability. The poet was summoned to a private audience with a council of scholars and generals, their faces etched with concern. Maps of distant provinces lay spread across a lacquered table, pins marking rebellious factions, bandit strongholds, and supply routes. One general, scarred from campaigns in the north, traced a finger along the Yellow River. "The unrest grows like frost across the land," he said gravely. "If the emperor delays even for a fortnight, the fragile alliances we maintain could fracture. Provinces loyal yesterday may be lost tomorrow." The Lady of Jade Pavilion appeared silently, her expression as serene as ever, yet imbued with the subtle weight of awareness. She motioned for the poet to observe, not merely listen. "History," she whispered, "is not written only by victories. It is etched by the moments when loyalty is tested, when ambition awakens, when silence conceals danger. You must record both the seen and the sensed, the spoken and the unspoken." As night fell, emissaries arrived from provinces along the empire's western frontier. Their eyes were wary, their hands carrying scrolls wrapped in protective silk. They spoke in coded phrases, each word weighed, each pause deliberate. The poet, seated at a discreet distance, recorded every subtle inflection, the sway of a shoulder, the tremor in a hand, the almost imperceptible glance toward a companion. It was here, amid whispered counsel and inked reports, that he realized the empire's strength rested as much on perception as on armies, as much on understanding as on action. Outside the palace, the city of Chang'an seemed to shift in response to the unseen currents. Lanterns swayed in gusts, shadows stretched across stone pathways, and even the river, usually tranquil under moonlight, reflected a restless shimmer. Street vendors closed early, their movements brisk yet cautious. Travelers lingered near the city gates, sensing subtle tension, while guards patrolled with heightened vigilance. The poet's brush captured the interplay of light and shadow, the faint flicker of anxiety across faces, the subtle signals of a city aware of the approaching storm. In the palace's inner quarters, the emperor convened a secret council. Strategies were debated quietly, alliances tested with careful questions, and envoys observed for signs of hidden loyalty or treachery. The poet present as witness noted the delicate balance of power, the tilt of a head indicating deference or doubt, the measured placement of a hand upon the table, the pause before a word was spoken, signaling both intent and restraint. Every gesture was a lesson in governance, every silence a repository of meaning. The Lady of Jade Pavilion guided him to a secluded balcony overlooking the northern gardens. Moonlight illuminated the frost-kissed leaves of winter plum, the ponds partially frozen, reflections fragmented like broken glass. "The empire," she said softly, "is at its most vulnerable when its beauty appears unshaken. Rebellion does not roar in the day, it whispers in corridors, in provinces, in hearts. Observe, record, and remember. Only then can history preserve both triumph and caution." Suddenly, distant horns echoed from the city gates, signals from the outer provinces. Couriers arrived in swift succession, bearing reports of uprisings, banditry, and defiance. The poet noted their urgency, the subtle panic concealed beneath practiced composure, and the weight of the emperor's response, a measured calm, masking the tension that threatened to ripple through every courtly layer. Each action, each decision, became a thread in the fragile tapestry of imperial stability. Through the night, emissaries and ministers strategized, tracing supply lines, dispatching loyal troops, and negotiating with wavering governors. The poet, ink flowing across scrolls, captured the interplay of power, loyalty, and subtle influence. He wrote not only of decisions and movements, but of human emotion, the fear, the hope, the ambition, and the quiet determination that underpinned the empire's response. Each line became a mirror of the unseen, the whispering forces that shape destiny far more profoundly than grand battles alone. By dawn, Chang'an remained still, the city cloaked in frost and early morning mist. Lanterns extinguished, rooftops glittering with frost, and the river reflected pale sunlight like liquid silver. The poet, brush in hand, paused to reflect on the night's events. Though the empire had held, he knew the shadow of rebellion lingered, stretching across distant provinces like a cold wind. The Tang Dynasty's brilliance, though dazzling, was always entwined with fragility, the delicate equilibrium of ambition, loyalty, and subtle maneuvering that could shift with a single misstep. As he recorded his final lines for the night, the poet understood the weight of observation, the responsibility of witnessing. History was not merely the record of triumphs, it was also the preservation of the quiet, tense moments when destiny hung on the whisper of action, the flicker of intent, and the unseen hands that shaped an empire's path. Outside, the frost-laden city waited, unaware that the threads of rebellion had already begun to stir, threading their way into the empire's future. The seasons had turned once more over Chang'an. Winter had retreated, leaving the city bathed in the soft warmth of early spring. Ginkgo trees budding and plum blossoms opening in gentle defiance of the cold that lingered in shadowed corners. The poet walked slowly through the imperial gardens, scrolls and brushes tucked beneath his robes, pausing at every detail. The curve of a carved bridge, the glint of sunlight on a pond rippling beneath falling petals, the delicate fragrance of jasmine carried on a whispering breeze. Time seemed both eternal and fleeting, and the empire itself felt suspended in the fragile balance between permanence and impermanence. He reflected on all he had witnessed, the majesty of the emperor's court, the intricate web of diplomacy, the silent currents of rebellion, and the quiet courage of those who preserved the empire's heart. Chang'an had been more than a city. It was a living tapestry, woven from silk and smoke, from whispered secrets and public splendor, from the dreams of merchants, poets, scholars, and warriors alike. Every thread mattered, every gesture held meaning, and every fleeting moment could tip the scales of history. The poet's footsteps led him to the edge of the Western Gardens, where a small pavilion overlooked the city walls. Here, he paused, setting his scrolls upon a low stone table, and gazed at the sprawling city below. Roofs glimmered in the soft sunlight, streets stretched in endless patterns, and the river glimmered like molten silver weaving through the city. In the distance, the mountains stood silent and eternal, guardians of both danger and opportunity, the same peaks that had seen caravans traverse deserts, carrying silk, spices, and stories to lands far beyond the empire's reach. He thought of Dunhuang, of camels moving like shadows across golden sands, of caravans threading through oases under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow men whole. He thought of the merchant prince, who balanced commerce and diplomacy with subtle grace, and of the Lady of Jade Pavilion, who revealed the quiet power of perception, patience, and understanding. He remembered the Festival of Lanterns, when light and shadow, celebration and reflection mingled to reveal both the brilliance and fragility of empire. And he remembered the shadows of rebellion, the whispered tensions that revealed the hidden currents sustaining Tang authority, even in moments when power seemed absolute. He dipped his brush into ink and began to write, capturing not the grand battles or monumental proclamations, but the essence of life within the empire, the ephemeral, delicate moments that made history human. He wrote of courtiers whose loyalty was tested in silence, of consorts whose beauty and insight influenced destinies, of merchants whose caravan paths carried culture and ideas across deserts, mountains, and rivers. Each word was deliberate, a meditation on continuity and fragility, an acknowledgement that the empire's endurance depended not merely on armies or decrees, but on observation, insight, and human connection. In the palace below, life continued in its eternal rhythm. Eunuchs moved silently through corridors. Musicians tuned their zithers, scholars pored over texts, and the emperor's gaze rested on distant provinces through reports and maps. The poet knew that even now, unseen, decisions were being made that would ripple through towns and mountains, villages and deserts, shaping lives far beyond Chang'an. History was alive in these small, deliberate acts, in the silent moments where loyalty, wisdom, and courage converged. As dusk approached, lanterns were lit along the gardens, casting golden reflections upon ponds where lotus leaves had begun to re-emerge from winter's frost. The poet paused to watch the gentle sway of water and light, feeling a profound sense of continuity. The way the empire endured, despite unrest, despite ambition, despite the inexorable passage of time. The Tang Dynasty, he realized, was both human and eternal, built on beauty and wisdom, on commerce and culture, on poetry, diplomacy, and courage. It was fragile, yet enduring, like smoke rising from incense, ephemeral, yet carrying stories far beyond the moment. The poet closed his scrolls carefully, securing them with a silk cord, and looked out over Chang'an one last time before evening fully settled. He understood that his role was not merely to observe, but to preserve, to translate the ephemeral rhythms of life, power, and culture into a record that would endure. In every brushstroke, in every word, he captured the heartbeat of an empire, the rhythm of silk caravans, the glimmer of lanterns, the subtle sway of political currents, and the quiet whispers that shaped history in ways invisible to those not attuned. From the pavilion, he glimpsed the emperor and consort walking beneath the moonlit corridors of the palace, their figures serene and commanding, guardians of a civilization whose brilliance was matched only by its fragility. The poet felt the weight of memory and responsibility, the knowledge that even as empires rose and fell, the human stories, the moments of courage, insight, and beauty endured. He lifted his brush once more, ink flowing across paper, translating life into permanence, capturing the legacy of silk and smoke. And so, beneath the soft glow of lanterns, the delicate fragrance of blossoming gardens, and the eternal gaze of the mountains, the poet wrote. He wrote of Chang'an, of Dunhuang, of the merchants, scholars, soldiers, and consorts who had shaped an empire with both brilliance and subtlety. He wrote of history as it was lived, not merely as it was recorded. In every line, every stroke, the Tang dynasty endured, not only in stone and silk, but in memory, in art, in the quiet rhythm of observation, and in the enduring story of a civilization whose legacy would transcend time itself. The sun rose slowly the next morning, gilding roofs and gardens, carrying the promise of continuity. The poet, scrolls in hand, left the pavilion, stepping onto pathways that had witnessed centuries of life, ambition, and artistry. He understood fully now that the empire's greatest treasures were neither gold nor silk, neither armies nor decrees, but the delicate human threads that wove together the brilliance, fragility, and enduring spirit of the Tang dynasty, a legacy of silk and smoke, carried in stories whispered across deserts and preserved in the quiet act of witnessing. Chang'an, the imperial capital, thrived as a bustling nexus of culture, politics, and commerce. Silk caravans arrived from distant deserts, merchants traded exotic goods, and scholars, poets, and artists wove the city into a tapestry of intellect and beauty. The story follows the poet, an observer of both public grandeur and hidden whispers, capturing the rhythm of daily life, imperial ceremonies, and delicate political maneuvers. Readers witness the elegance of court life, the subtle power of consorts like Yang Guifei, and the complexity of alliances within the palace. The city itself becomes a character. Lantern-lit streets, lotus-filled ponds, and elaborate pavilions reflecting both imperial authority and human aspiration. Through the poet's eyes, we see Tang society as a living organism, where commerce, culture, and diplomacy pulse in harmony. Beyond Chang'an, the story unfolds across distant provinces, caravan routes, and desert outposts. Merchants traverse deserts, facing danger and opportunity. Governors negotiate with local leaders, balancing authority and rebellion. Bandits threaten trade, creating tension that ripples toward the capital. The poet witnesses both diplomacy and secrecy, learning how loyalty, deception, and ambition shape the empire's fate. Festivals like the Lantern Festival reveal the Tang's vibrant culture while concealing the underlying fragility of power. Through whispers, gestures, and secret messages, readers understand the subtle currents that maintain harmony in a sprawling empire. The narrative blends everyday human experience with the weight of imperial responsibility, showing that history is as much about small, delicate choices as it is about grand conquests. The Tang Dynasty was not only a political powerhouse, but also a cradle of art, poetry, music, and philosophy. Ceremonies, lantern festivals, and palace rituals provide a window into cultural values, emphasizing harmony, respect, and subtlety. The poet observes scholars debating Confucian ideals, artists crafting intricate silk patterns, and consorts influencing decisions with grace and wisdom. Religious practices, Buddhist temples, Taoist rites, and the symbolism of nature, lotus, moonlight, and seasonal change, interweave with daily life. These details illuminate a society where aesthetics, ethics, and politics coexist, where beauty is deeply connected to governance, and where understanding nuance is essential for survival. The story preserves both the grandeur and the human element of Tang culture, giving readers insight into an era that shaped East Asia profoundly. The poet's journey reveals the enduring impact of Tang civilization. Silk and smoke become metaphors for the delicate interplay of material wealth, artistic brilliance, and invisible social currents. Rebellion, diplomacy, festivals, and courtly intrigue demonstrate that empires thrive not only through power, but through observation, insight, and careful action. Readers are shown how beauty, human connection, and subtle influence define history as much as battles and decrees. By witnessing both triumph and tension, the poet records a nuanced portrait of the Tang Dynasty, a civilization whose legacy lives in art, culture, and stories. The final reflection emphasizes that the past endures through careful attention to detail, memory, and the preservation of both spectacle and subtlety, teaching the timeless lesson that history is shaped by both grandeur and the quiet whispers of those who observe.